Section 1. Into the Shadows of Spooner Street. There is a street somewhere in the state of Rhode Island, or at least there is supposed to be, that does not follow the rules of the world you and I live in. It sits in a neighborhood that cannot quite be mapped, in a town whose geography contradicts itself from one episode to the next, populated by people who have died and returned, who have aged and then forgotten they aged, who have confessed the darkest corners of their souls on a Tuesday evening, and then laughed about it the following week as though the confession had never happened. This is Spooner Street, and tonight we are going to walk down it very slowly, in the dark, and look at everything that doesn't quite make sense. This is not a countdown. This is not a ranking. What this is a long, slow, deeply curious wander through one of the most fascinating animated universes ever committed to television. A universe that has been running continuously since 1999, that was canceled and brought back from the dead, that has outlasted cultural moments and trends in entire generations of television storytelling, and that still, after all these years, contains genuine mysteries at its center. Questions the show has never answered, contradictions that were never resolved, characters whose true natures remain, even now, deeply ambiguous. We are going to take our time tonight. There is no rush. The mysteries of this fictional street are not going anywhere, and neither are you. So settle in. Let your body find its most comfortable position. Let the tension in your shoulders begin to soften, and let's begin walking together down a road that looks, from the outside, like a perfectly ordinary animated suburban street, but is, upon closer examination, one of the strangest places in the history of American television. The house at the center of everything is a white two-story colonial at 31 Spooner Street. It has a blue front door. It has a modest lawn. It has a family inside it that, depending on the episode you happen to be watching, ranges from warmly comedic to genuinely heartbreaking, from absurdist farce to something approaching tragic drama. The family is named Griffin. The father is named Peter. The mother is named Lois. There is a teenage daughter named Meg, a teenage son named Chris, a baby named Stewie, and a dog named Brian who speaks in full sentences, drinks martinis, and has published at least one novel. This is the family we are going to spend our time with tonight. Not the version of them you see in the loudest, most chaotic episodes, but the version that exists in the silences between the jokes, the version that emerges when you slow down and ask, who are these people really, and why do they keep choosing to stay in that house together? Before we begin in earnest, let me tell you something about the nature of this kind of storytelling. A show that runs for 20 or more seasons does not begin with a complete plan. It begins with characters and situations, and then it grows, accumulates, contradicts itself, retcons its own history, and gradually develops something that feels less like a planned narrative and more like a mythology, a body of lore that has been shaped by dozens of different writers over decades, all of them adding their own interpretations and contradictions to a shared universe that no single person fully controls. This is what makes long-running animated shows so fascinating to explore. They are not novels with a single authorial vision. They are more like folk tales, stories that get retold and reshaped every time they pass through a new pair of hands, accumulating layers of meaning that were never consciously intended. The mysteries we are going to explore tonight are, in some cases, the result of deliberate storytelling choices. Things the writers clearly intended to leave ambiguous, threads they pulled tight and then chose not to resolve. But in other cases, the mysteries are accidental. They are the product of decades of inconsistency, of writers forgetting what earlier writers established, of characters evolving beyond their original conception and becoming something more complicated than anyone planned. Both kinds of mystery are interesting. Both kinds tell us something true about the universe we are exploring. So let's begin. Let's start at the beginning, which is always the best place to start, and work our way slowly through everything that has been left unanswered on this remarkable, infuriating, sometimes beautiful, occasionally profound animated street. The neighborhood itself is quiet at this hour. The houses along Spooner Street are dark, their windows dim rectangles against the night sky. The streetlights cast pools of amber light on the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, there is the low hum of the highway that shouldn't be able to reach this neighborhood because the neighborhood's location doesn't quite make sense in relation to any highway. But it's there anyway, that low hum, because this is a place where the rules are different. Walk with me. We have a long night ahead of us, and there is so much to discover. The first thing you notice when you really look at this street is how still everything is. There is a quality of suspension to it, as though the entire neighborhood exists slightly outside of time, as though the clocks here move at a different rate than the clocks in the world you came from. The children on this street have been teenagers for over 20 years. The adults have been middle-aged for just as long. The dog has been approximately 8 years old in human terms for the entire run of the show, even though he references a specific birth year that, by now, would make him considerably older. The street exists in a perpetual present that accommodates the past only selectively and inconsistently. This is one of the first and most fundamental mysteries of the universe we are exploring tonight. Why do the characters not age? The obvious answer, that this is an animated comedy, and aging would disrupt the comedic premise, is true, but it is not the whole truth. Because the show has at various points directly addressed the passage of time, characters have referenced specific years. Events have been placed on specific dates. The children have, at moments, shown awareness of the passage of time and the fact that they have been stuck in these particular life stages for far longer than is natural. The show knows it has a continuity problem. It has made jokes about the continuity problem, and yet the problem remains unsolved, which means it is not really being treated as a problem. It is being treated as a feature. Some fan theories, and we will get to these in detail later in our journey tonight, suggest that the temporal strangeness of this street is not a flaw in the storytelling, but a clue to the storytelling's true nature. What if the characters are not simply ageless because of animated convenience, but are ageless because of something specific to the nature of the universe they inhabit? What if the suspension of time on Spooner Street is meaningful rather than arbitrary? We will return to this question. For now, let's keep walking. It is worth noting, before we go any further, that the show we are discussing has never been a simple comedy. From its very earliest episodes, it operated on multiple registers simultaneously. It could be aggressively silly, and then, in the same breath, achingly sincere. It could make a joke that felt cheap and disposable, and then, a few scenes later, deliver a moment of genuine emotional resonance that landed harder than anything in prestige television. This is part of what makes it so interesting to examine. A purely comedic show does not generate genuine mysteries. It generates setups and punchlines. But a show that occasionally insists on being emotionally true, that occasionally asks its characters to confront who they actually are and what they actually want, that show generates the kind of lingering questions that keep you thinking long after the episode has ended. And this show has generated those questions. It has generated them abundantly. Some of them are about plot, about what really happened, about what the truth behind a particular storyline really is. Others are about character, about who these people are beneath the surface, about what they are capable of, about what they actually feel for each other. And some of the deepest mysteries are structural, about what the show itself is, about what it is doing, about what it is trying to say about the world. Tonight, we are going to sit with all of these mysteries. We are going to let them breathe. We are not going to rush to conclusions, because the conclusions are not really the point. The point is the sitting with, the examining, the slow turning over of questions that have no definitive answers, because the questions themselves are beautiful. The unanswered questions of a long-running story are like windows that open onto something larger than the story itself. They invite you into a space of imagination that the story's creators may never have intended, but that belongs to you now, as a person who has spent years with these characters in this world. So close your eyes for a moment, if you like. Or keep them open. Either is fine, just breathe. And let's go deeper. If you're enjoying this journey through the mysteries of this fictional street, take a moment right now to leave a comment below. Tell us your favorite unsolved mystery from the show, the question that has always lingered in the back of your mind. And if this is the kind of content that helps you unwind and drift off, consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss a new exploration. We do this for the love of the lore, and every subscriber means the world. Section 2. The Mystery of Peter Griffin's True Intelligence. Let us talk about Peter Griffin. Peter Griffin is, at first glance, a simple character. He is large. He is loud. He is, in the language of the show itself, not particularly intelligent. He works, for most of the show's run, at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. He watches television, he eats, he gets into elaborate physical altercations with a giant chicken, whose origins we will discuss in their own dedicated section of tonight's exploration. He loves his family in a loud, unexamined, slightly chaotic way that sometimes looks like love and sometimes looks like something more complicated. He is, by the show's own accounting, a buffoon, and a lovable one most of the time, though the show has increasingly allowed the lovability to sit uncomfortably alongside something darker. But here's the question that lingers if you pay attention across enough episodes. Is Peter Griffin actually as unintelligent as the show presents him to be? And if he is not, if there is a Peter Griffin beneath the surface who is something more complicated than a lovable idiot, then what happened to that Peter? When did he become what we see? And perhaps most provocatively, does the real Peter Griffin know on some level that he is performing a version of himself that is not the whole truth? Start with the episode that the show itself uses as a kind of canonical benchmark for Peter's intelligence. In the fourth season, Peter discovers that he is, by clinical definition, mentally disabled, that his IQ scores place him below the threshold that would categorize him as having full cognitive function. The episode is called Petarded, and it mines this revelation for comedy in the way that the show mines most of its darkest material, loudly and aggressively, using the comedy as a kind of shield against the genuine emotional weight of what it is depicting. But here is what is interesting about the episode. It does not explain how Peter came to have this level of cognitive function. It does not establish whether he was born this way or whether his intellectual capacity was reduced by something that happened to him over the course of his life. And this matters because there is a significant body of evidence across the show's run suggesting that Peter Griffin is not consistently at the cognitive level petarded would imply. There are episodes, not a few, but a meaningful number, in which Peter demonstrates knowledge, awareness, strategic thinking, and emotional intelligence that do not fit the profile of a man whose IQ places him in a category of genuine intellectual disability. There are moments when Peter makes observations that are not just funny, but genuinely insightful. There are moments when he navigates complex social situations with a subtlety that his established character should not be capable of. And there are moments, rare but unmistakable, when something flickers behind Peter Griffin's eyes that looks, for just an instant, like genuine depth. What are we to make of this? One interpretation, the simplest one, is that the show is inconsistent, that different writers have different ideas of how intelligent Peter is, and that the inconsistency is simply a product of decades of rotating creative teams rather than a deliberate mystery to be solved. This interpretation is certainly true to some extent, but it is not entirely satisfying because some of the moments of unexpected Peterian intelligence are so pointed, so specifically written, that they feel intentional. They feel like something the writers were putting in on purpose, a hint that the character is more than he appears. Consider Peter's relationship with alcohol. The show treats Peter's drinking as a comedy element. He is a regular at a bar called The Drunken Clam. He drinks beer with the casual frequency of a man who has organized his entire social life around the ritual of drinking, and his drinking rarely has consequences that the show treats as genuinely serious. But if you watch closely, the drinking is always present in the episodes, where Peter is at his most diminished. When Peter does something that makes you wince, when he causes real harm to the people around him, and he does, the show does not entirely hide this, he is almost always drunk or coming down from a period of heavy drinking. And when Peter has his moments of unexpected clarity, his moments of genuine insight or emotional honesty, he is frequently sober, or at least less comprehensively intoxicated than usual. This pattern, if it is a pattern, would suggest something interesting about the character, that his cognitive limitations are not entirely fixed, that they are amplified by his drinking in a way that has become so constant, so normalized within the universe of the show, that it looks like his baseline state rather than a chemically induced one. If Peter Griffin has spent most of his adult life in some degree of alcohol-mediated cognitive fog, then the question of his true intelligence becomes genuinely interesting. What is Peter Griffin like when he is fully sober? The show has never really shown us. It has given us glimpses, but never sustained portrait. Now let us complicate this further by introducing what the show reveals about Peter's biological father. In the fifth season, in an episode that deserves more analytical attention than it typically receives, Peter discovers that the man who raised him, Francis Griffin, a devout and rigidly traditional Irish Catholic whose relationship with Peter was defined by disappointment and conditional love, is not his biological father. Peter's biological father is a man named Mickey McFinnigan, an Irishman of considerable charm who Peter travels to Ireland to find. Mickey McFinnigan is, notably, a man of presence and charisma. He is funny and warm and possessed of a social intelligence that makes him immediately appealing. He is, in other words, someone who does not immediately read as the biological source of the particular flavors of Peter's incompetence. But here is what is more interesting than Mickey himself. The revelation of Mickey's existence recontextualizes Peter's entire upbringing. Francis Griffin, Peter's non-biological father, was a man who expressed his relationship to Peter almost entirely through criticism. The message of Peter's childhood, delivered consistently and without much apparent warmth, was that Peter was not enough, not smart enough, not disciplined enough, not devout enough, not serious enough. Francis's love was conditional in the most damaging way possible, tied to a standard of performance that Peter, as a child, could never meet. What does that kind of upbringing do to a person? Particularly to a person who may have had, underneath the inadequacy his father constantly projected onto him, genuine capabilities that were never nurtured, never acknowledged, never allowed to develop? One answer, and this is speculative, but it is the kind of speculation the show's own lore invites, is that it produces a person who internalizes the message of his childhood so completely that he stops trying to be more than what his father told him he was. A person who performs stupidity because, on some deep level, he believes it is the truest thing about him. A person for whom intellectual limitation has become not just a fact, but an identity, a costume he put on to survive his childhood and then forgot he was wearing. This is a genuinely melancholy reading of a character who is most often discussed in terms of how many times he has knocked over a lamp or driven a car through a building. But the show supports it, not loudly. The show is rarely loud about its most meaningful character work, preferring to slip it in between the jokes, where it can catch you off guard. But it supports it. There is also the matter of Peter's physical condition and its effects on his cognition. Over the course of the show, Peter Griffin has sustained an almost incomprehensible number of severe head injuries. He has been hit by cars, trucks, and various pieces of heavy machinery. He has fallen from significant heights multiple times. He has had objects of considerable mass impact his skull with enough force to, in any realistic context, cause serious and permanent neurological damage. The show treats these injuries as comedy, as it treats most physical suffering. The suffering happens, it is mined for laughs, and then it is forgotten. In the next scene, the character returned to his baseline without any of the consequences that would, in the real world, accumulate over time. But here is an interesting thought experiment. What if we took the injuries seriously? What if we accepted that Peter Griffin has, over the course of his adult life, experienced repeated traumatic brain injuries, and that these injuries have, episode by episode, degraded his cognitive function in ways that the show depicts as comedy, but that represent something genuinely tragic? What if the Peter Griffin of the early seasons, still bumbling, still loud, but possessed of certain kinds of social intelligence that later seasons seem to erode, is a meaningfully different person from the Peter Griffin of the later seasons, and the difference is neurological? This reading gives the show's often criticized Flanderization of Peter Griffin, the process by which his character became increasingly extreme and his behavior increasingly difficult to root for, a different quality. It transforms what critics read as lazy writing into something that could be understood as, if not intentional, at least meaningfully coherent. A portrait of a man whose cognitive landscape has been genuinely, irreversibly altered by a lifetime of physical misadventure, and who is becoming, as the seasons progress, less capable of the moments of genuine humanity that made him sympathetic in the earlier years. Is this what the writers intended? Almost certainly not, or at least not all of them. But the text supports it. The show has built, whether it meant to or not, a character whose history of injury, whose upbringing of conditional love and consistent messaging of inadequacy, and whose decades of heavy alcohol use combine to create a genuinely complicated portrait of a man who is not simply a fool, who is, in fact, a man in whom something went wrong, or perhaps in whom something was prevented from going right, and whose most visible behavior is the result of those accumulated deprivations rather than the whole of who he is. There are episodes that seem to gesture toward this complexity explicitly. The episode Tom Tucker, the Man and His Dream has Peter, in a subplot, demonstrating genuine organizational competence that contradicts his usual depiction. The episode Road to the North Pole has Peter showing moments of emotional clarity and parental love that feel, in their sincerity, like something surfacing from beneath his usual presentation. These moments are always brief, always quickly covered over by the comedy machinery that the show uses to prevent its emotional revelations from lingering too long. But they are there. The deepest version of the Peter Griffin mystery is this. Somewhere inside the person we have been watching for over 20 seasons, there is a person who might have been different. Not necessarily better. Complexity is not the same as goodness, and the show makes clear that Peter's most harmful behaviors are not simply the product of his limitations, but of choices he makes that he could, at some level, make differently. But different. More present. More capable of the sustained attention that genuine love requires. The tragedy of Peter Griffin, if we allow ourselves to read him as a tragic figure rather than simply a comic one, is not that he is stupid. It is that he is not entirely sure whether he is stupid, and the uncertainty has become its own kind of paralysis. He keeps choosing the beer. He keeps choosing the television. He keeps choosing the easy path of self-diminishment, because the alternative, the path toward whatever he might actually be capable of, requires a kind of sustained courage that his childhood never taught him he was allowed to have. That is the mystery of Peter Griffin. Not whether he is smart or stupid, but who he would have been if someone had believed in him early enough to matter. Section 3. Brian Griffin, the dark biography of a talking dog. If Peter Griffin is the mystery of potential unfulfilled, then Brian Griffin is the mystery of self-awareness weaponized against the self. Brian is, in some ways, the most sophisticated character the show has produced, and also the most self-defeating. He is a dog who can speak, who can think, who has read extensively and has opinions about literature and film and politics and the nature of existence. He has a college education, or at least he attended Brown University, though the circumstances of his departure and the question of whether he ever graduated are, like so many things in this universe, inconsistently handled. He has written a novel that the show depicts as a source of both pride and profound shame, depending on the episode. He drinks martinis with the specific, considered enthusiasm of a person who has made alcohol into a kind of aesthetic statement rather than simply a habit. And he is, beneath all of this, beneath the sophistication and the literary references and the carefully maintained persona of the cultured, world-weary intellectual, deeply, foundationally unhappy. The question that the Brian Griffin lore raises, if you pay attention to it across enough episodes, is not whether he is unhappy. That is established clearly. The question is why. What is the source of the particular quality of Brian Griffin's unhappiness? It is not the same as Peter's unhappiness, or Meg's, or Lois's. Each member of this family has their own specific flavor of existential difficulty, and Brian's is distinctive. It is the unhappiness of a person who can see exactly where he is, and exactly where he wishes he were, who understands the gap between those two places with perfect clarity, and who uses that very clarity as a reason for not doing anything about it. To understand Brian Griffin, you have to understand the specifics of his origin story, which the show reveals in fragments across multiple seasons, and which, when assembled, adds up to something quite bleak. Brian was born in a litter of puppies in Austin, Texas. His mother was a dog named Biscuit. His father was not a significant presence. Dogs do not typically have significant paternal presences, and the show does not try to give Brian's father narrative weight. Brian's mother, however, Biscuit, is significant and sad. Biscuit was, for the period of Brian's early life when he could have formed a meaningful bond with her, taken away from him. Not voluntarily, not through any failure on either of their parts. She was taken away by the circumstances of being a dog in a world that does not treat dogs as people, even when those dogs demonstrably are people in every meaningful sense. Biscuit was eventually turned into a coffee table. The show delivers this revelation with the combination of horror and absurdity that is its signature mode for its darkest material. But the horror is real. Brian's mother, from whom he was separated before their relationship could fully form, ended her life as furniture. This is a loss that Brian never processed. He could not have processed it because there was no framework available to him in which the loss was real enough to grieve. He was a dog. Dogs lose their mothers. This is what happens. The fact that Brian is a person, that he has the emotional and intellectual capacity to understand what the loss means, did not come with any mechanism for integrating that understanding into a coherent narrative of selfhood. And so the loss simply sits there, unexamined in the foundation of his character. Then there is the question of how Brian came to live with the Griffin family. He was, before the Griffins, a stray, a dog without a home, without a family, without a fixed address. Peter Griffin encountered him on a road, pulled over, and offered him what the show frames as rescue: a home, a family, a place to belong. And Brian accepted. Of course he accepted. He was a stray on a road, and someone was offering him shelter. What else would he do? But here's the complication. Being rescued by Peter Griffin is not the same as being equal to Peter Griffin. Brian lives in the Griffin home, not as a member of the family in the full legal and social sense. He cannot vote. He cannot own property in his own name. He cannot enter into contracts without the implicit backing of the family that houses him. But as something more than a pet, less than a person, occupying a category that doesn't have a name because nothing quite like Brian is supposed to exist. He is a dog who is also a person in a world that has not made any social or legal accommodation for this reality. This is the structural condition of Brian Griffin's life, and it is, when you sit with it, quite terrible. He is intelligent enough to understand exactly the category he occupies. He is intelligent enough to know that his sophisticated social presentation, the martinis, the literary references, the carefully cultivated persona of the educated intellectual, is, at some level, a performance designed to negotiate the gap between what he is socially recognized as being and what he knows himself to be. He performs personhood because the alternative is to be treated as a dog, and he is not a dog, not in any meaningful sense. But the performance is exhausting. The performance is also, and this is the cruelest part, never quite convincing, not even to Brian himself. Because Brian knows, on some level, that the show visits and then retreats from, but that is always there, that his sophisticated persona is constructed over a foundation of unaddressed grief and unprocessed abandonment. The martinis are not an aesthetic statement. They are, among other things, a way of maintaining a particular self-concept against the constant pressure of a world that does not quite recognize that self. The novel, the unfinished novel, the perpetually in progress novel, the novel that becomes a published book, the show depicts as a failure. The novel that haunts Brian across seasons as both aspiration and source of shame is not simply a creative project. It is an attempt to prove to the world and to himself that he is real, that his interiority is real, that his suffering and his joy and his capacity for insight are real, and that they deserve to be recorded and witnessed. The novel is never quite as good as Brian needs it to be, and this is not because Brian is not talented. The show gives him moments of genuine verbal and intellectual beauty. It is because no single work of art can bear the weight of all the things Brian is asking his novel to prove. He is asking it to be the evidence of his own personhood, and no book can carry that. There is an episode, one of the most discussed episodes in the show's entire run, one that attracted attention for the unusual seriousness of its ambition, called Brian and Stewie, in which Brian and Stewie are locked together in a bank vault overnight and are forced to confront each other with a directness that the show usually works very hard to avoid. The episode is notable for many reasons, but the most important thing it reveals about Brian is this. He has at various points in his life been close enough to ending his life that the possibility is not purely theoretical. Stewie asks him, and Brian, in the particular intimacy of the vault, answers honestly. He has been that close. He has stood at the edge of something very dark, and he has chosen, each time, to step back from it. Not because of hope exactly, not because the future has seemed to offer something specific to look forward to, but because of the daily texture of the life he has. Because of the small things. Because of Stewie, in that particular moment, asking the question and caring about the answer. This is when you let yourself feel the full weight of it, a devastating portrait of a character who is more often discussed in terms of his pretentiousness or his relationship failures than in terms of the genuine suffering that runs beneath those surface characteristics. Brian Griffin is not pretentious as a personality type. He is pretentious as a survival strategy. The persona he has built, the cultured dog, the intellectual companion, the sophisticated observer of the human condition, is a structure erected over an absence that has never been named and therefore cannot be healed. The relationship between Brian and the bottle is worth examining separately because it is one of the most consistently depicted elements of his character across the show's entire run. Brian drinks. He drinks constantly. He drinks in the mornings sometimes. He drinks when he is happy, and he drinks when he is sad, and he drinks when nothing in particular is happening. The show treats this as a comedy beat. The dog with the martini glass is a reliable visual gag, but it has, in its more honest episodes, allowed the darkness of Brian's relationship with alcohol to surface. Brian's drinking is not recreational. It is, in the clinical sense that the show sometimes allows itself to gesture toward, compulsive. It is the drinking of a person for whom sobriety feels unsafe, for whom the clarity of being fully present to his own consciousness is too much to bear without chemical mediation. When Brian is drunk, he can maintain the persona. When Brian is sober, genuinely, fully sober, something shows through the persona that he cannot control and cannot put away. The persona slips, the grief shows, the loneliness becomes visible. The show has had, at various points, the courage to show us this. The episodes that deal with Brian's drinking as a genuine problem, rather than a comedy premise, are among the most interesting episodes in the show's history. Not because they resolve the problem, because they don't and can't within the show's format, but because they acknowledge it. They acknowledge that Brian Griffin is a person in pain, not a drunk dog who is amusing because of the incongruity of his sophistication and his species. There is also the matter of Brian's romantic life, which is a subject the show has returned to many times, and which consistently produces the same result. Failure. Brian falls in love repeatedly. He pursues women, and the occasional man, though the show is inconsistent about Brian's sexuality in ways that reflect the inconsistency of the show's engagement with that subject generally, with an intensity and a sincerity that is appealing and also always slightly desperate. The desperation is the tell. Brian falls in love the way a person falls in love when they are not quite sure they deserve to be loved, when every relationship carries the weight of trying to prove something that should not need to be proven. He tries too hard. He reveals too much too fast. He becomes, in relationships, the version of himself that is least likely to sustain what he wants. The needy version, the insecure version, the version that has not yet learned that love cannot fix the specific wound he is carrying. His relationship with Lois Griffin, which the show has treated as a recurring thread, never quite consummated, perpetually charged with the particular intensity of proximity and prohibition, is perhaps the most interesting of his romantic complications. Brian loves Lois in a way that the show presents as comic, as one of his many affectations and pretensions, but that, when examined, looks more complicated and more sincere. Lois represents, for Brian, not just romantic attraction, but something more fundamental. She represents the stability and the love that his own mother could not provide. She is the fixed point in his domestic world. She is the person who chose to house him, who treats him with consistent warmth, who sees him as something more than a pet, but something she can accommodate within the category of beloved family member. The romantic feeling is real, but the thing underneath the romantic feeling is older and deeper than romance. He cannot have Lois. He knows this. He has always known this. And this particular impossibility is, in some ways, a comfort to him, because as long as the love is impossible, it cannot fail. It cannot disappoint him the way his other relationships have. It is permanently protected by its own impossibility. Brian Griffin is one of the most fascinating and melancholy characters in American animated television. And the mystery at his center is the mystery of the self-aware person who cannot use their self-awareness to free themselves. He sees himself clearly. He can articulate with precision the patterns that limit him. He knows where the wounds are. He knows what the wounds need. And knowing none of this changes anything, because knowing is not the same as healing. And Brian Griffin, for all his sophistication, has never quite learned how to heal. Section 4. Stewie's Arsenal, the baby who shouldn't exist. Now we come to the character around whom the show's deepest mysteries cluster most densely. Stewie Griffin is 1 year old. He has been 1 year old for the entire run of the show. He is, by any reasonable biological measure, an infant. Pre-verbal, pre-ambulatory, cognitively at the stage of development that produces responses to faces and the recognition of familiar voices, not the construction of plasma cannons and the formulation of detailed plans for world domination. He cannot, by the standards of developmental psychology, be doing any of the things he does in almost every episode of the show. And yet, Stewie Griffin speaks in complete and grammatically sophisticated sentences. He speaks specifically in the cadences of a certain kind of mid-20th century mid-Atlantic accent. A voice that sounds like it was trained in a British boarding school, of the kind that produces cabinet ministers and minor royalty, overlaid with a distinctly American broadness that appears at specific moments of emotional stress. This voice is not natural to him in any biological sense. A 1 year old does not develop this voice. A 1 year old does not develop any voice, in the sense of a sustained and coherent speaking style. The voice is constructed. It is chosen. It is, in some sense, a performance. Why does Stewie Griffin speak the way he speaks? The question seems absurd. He speaks the way he speaks because the writers decided he should speak that way. Because the particular comedy of the character is built on the incongruity between his infant body and his archaic, formal, over-sophisticated verbal register. That is certainly true, but the show has at various moments gestured toward an in-universe explanation for Stewie's unusual development. That is, when you assemble it carefully, quite interesting. The simplest version of the in-universe explanation is genetic. Stewie is the child of Lois Pewterschmidt Griffin, a woman who, as we will explore in detail in the next section, is considerably more capable and considerably more ruthless than her presentation as a suburban housewife would suggest. And Stewie is the child of Peter Griffin, who, as we have just finished exploring, may be operating well below his native intellectual capacity for reasons that include childhood trauma, chronic alcohol use, and cumulative head injuries. But the Pewterschmidt genetics, the genetics of Lois's family, are formidable. The Pewterschmidts are described in the show's lore as one of the wealthiest families in New England. And in the peculiar Darwinian landscape of inherited wealth, this means they are descendants of people who were smart and ruthless enough, across multiple generations, to accumulate and maintain extraordinary resources. Stewie, on the Pewterschmidt side, is the product of significant genetic material, but genetics alone cannot explain a 1 year old building a time machine. Let's talk about the technology first, because the technology is genuinely astonishing, even within the show's universe, which accommodates all manner of scientific impossibilities. Stewie Griffin, operating from a bedroom in a middle-class house in a mid-sized New England city, has constructed a functional time machine, a mind control device, a laser rifle, a working jetpack, a teleportation unit, and a device for manipulating the weather, among many other pieces of technology that do not exist even in the theoretical literature of actual physics and engineering. These are not improved versions of existing technology. They are not clever extrapolations from current research. They are entirely novel, and they work. Where did Stewie learn to build these things? The show never explains this directly, and the explanation it gestures toward, that Stewie is simply a genius, that his infant body houses an intellect of extraordinary capacity, is insufficient on its own because genius does not produce engineers. Genius produces the capacity to learn engineering. The actual engineering, the practical knowledge of how to build a time machine, of what components to use and in what configuration and what energy source to power it, requires either education or independent derivation from first principles. Stewie has had no formal education. He is an infant who has been alive for approximately 1 year. He has not had time to independently derive from first principles a theory of time that is complete enough to enable the construction of a functional time machine. Unless he has. Unless the 1 year of Stewie's life has contained within it, by mechanisms the show has never explained, something equivalent to decades of intensive study and experimentation. Unless time for Stewie does not work the way it works for everyone else on this street, and his 1 year of life is not what it appears to be. This is where the Stewie Griffin mystery becomes genuinely deep, and where the fan theories become most interesting. Because there is a version of the Stewie story, a version that the show supports in fragmentary ways, in which Stewie Griffin is not simply a precocious infant, but something more fundamentally strange. Something for which the show has never found quite the right language, partly because finding the right language would require the show to commit to a version of its own mythology that it has consistently preferred to leave ambiguous. The time travel element of Stewie's life is crucial here. Stewie has traveled in time extensively. He has visited versions of his own past, his own future, and timelines that diverge significantly from the one he normally inhabits. The show is, by design, inconsistent about the rules of Stewie's time travel. Sometimes it seems to operate on a model where changes to the past alter the present, sometimes on a model where changed timelines simply branch off from the original, and sometimes on a model where the timeline snaps back to its original configuration, no matter what Stewie does. This inconsistency is in some ways a practical necessity. You cannot run a comedy about time travel on a rigorously consistent causal model, because the causal consequences would accumulate and become impossible to manage. But the inconsistency also raises a question. How much of what Stewie knows, including the technical knowledge that underlies his impossible devices, might he have acquired through his own past time travel? Here is a thought experiment that the show itself essentially invites. What if Stewie has already lived his life multiple times? What if the Stewie we see in any given episode is not experiencing the timeline for the first time, but experiencing a version of it that he has navigated before, or multiple times before, accumulating knowledge and capability across iterations of a life that, from the outside, appears to be only a year old? This would explain the technology, it would explain the vocabulary, it would explain the particular quality of Stewie's world weariness, which is one of his most consistent character traits. The sense that he has been here before, that he has seen this, that the experiences and emotions of his ostensibly new life are somehow familiar to him in a way that goes beyond what a 1-year-old should be able to feel. And then there is the British accent. The British accent is, perhaps, the single most discussed element of Stewie Griffin's characterization. Among people who think carefully about the show, it makes no sense. It makes no sense biologically. He was born in Rhode Island to an American mother and an American-Irish father, and no one in his immediate family speaks with any British inflection. It makes no sense developmentally. Children acquire accent from their environment, from the speech patterns of the people around them, and Stewie's environment does not contain the British speech patterns that would produce his accent. The accent is, by any normal explanation, impossible. The show has offered, across various episodes, a few different framings of the accent without ever committing to one. There is the framing in which the accent is simply part of Stewie's persona, chosen rather than acquired. In the same way that his elaborate vocabulary and his formal grammatical structures are chosen rather than acquired, part of the constructed identity of a person who has decided to be a specific kind of person and has arranged his presentation accordingly. There is the framing, floated in some fan interpretations and gently supported by certain episodes, that the accent is related to Stewie's possible British biological heritage, that somewhere in the Pewterschmidt or Griffin family tree, there is a British ancestor whose genetic contribution manifested in Stewie in an anomalous way. But the most interesting framing, the one that the show supports most directly, in the episode Send In Stewie Please, which is one of the most remarkable and psychologically dense episodes the show has produced, is that the accent is not the real Stewie at all. It is a layer. It is, like so many things about Stewie, a construction, a performance, a way of maintaining a particular self-concept against the vulnerability of being small and dependent, and not yet able to fully understand why he is the way he is. Send in Stewie, Please is an episode that takes place almost entirely in a therapist's office. Stewie, having been referred for behavioral evaluation, spends the episode in conversation with a therapist who has enough patience and enough skill to get past the performance to something more unguarded. In the course of this conversation, Stewie, for a few minutes, in a moment of genuine emotional nakedness that the show handles with unusual delicacy, drops the accent. His voice briefly becomes something softer, something more recognizably American, something that sounds, for those few minutes, like it could be the voice of a small child rather than the voice of an elaborate persona designed to keep small children at bay. These are the minutes that matter. The persona drops, and what is underneath it is not a master villain, not a weapons technician, not a sophisticate of the old world school. What is underneath it is a small person who wants, more than anything, to be seen. To have someone look at him without requiring him to perform and recognize that the performance is not all there is. The mystery of Stewie Griffin is the mystery of the persona. Not why he is so intelligent, though that is interesting. Not where the weapons come from, though that is fascinating. The mystery is why a being of his particular intelligence and capability has devoted so much of his extraordinary resources to building walls around himself. Why the weapons? Why the world domination plans that are so consistently, so reliably foiled? Plans that, if Stewie were serious about them, a being of his capability would surely be able to execute. Why the elaborate theatrical presentation of himself as a villain when the evidence consistently suggests that the villainy is itself a performance? A way of making his inner life into something that requires no vulnerability, no exposure, no risk of being genuinely known and then genuinely abandoned? Stewie Griffin is afraid of love. This is the deepest thing about him, and the show has known it from relatively early on, though it has committed to the knowledge only intermittently. He is afraid of it because his first experience of it, his relationship with Lois, with the mother whose milk sustained him and whose voice was the first voice he knew, was mediated by a distance that he could feel but not understand. Lois loves Stewie. The show is clear about this in its best episodes, but Lois is also tired and distracted and married to Peter, and working to maintain a family that makes significant demands on her attention. And Stewie, with his extraordinary sensitivity and his extraordinary capacity for observation, registered the distance before he had any framework for understanding it. He felt the gap between the love that Lois has for him and the total, consuming attentiveness that an infant requires, and he experienced the gap as abandonment. He has been building weapons ever since. Not to destroy the world, not really. To have something. To have something that no one can take away, that will still be there after the love disappoints again, that will still be functional and powerful, and is when the vulnerability of feeling real love for real people produces, as it always seems to produce in this family, some new form of pain. The plasma cannon in the crib is not aggression, it is insurance. And the British accent, the crisp, formal, impenetrable British accent, is the sound of a person who decided very early on that if the world was not going to meet him in the place of his real feelings, he would at least ensure that the world met a version of him that could never be wounded. That is the mystery of Stewie Griffin. Not the technology, the armor. Section 5, The Dark Lore of Lois Griffin. There is a particular kind of character that appears in long-running stories. A character who's established early as one thing, and then, as the story accumulates, reveals themselves to be something considerably more complicated. Lois Griffin is this kind of character. She was introduced as the warm, sensible center of the Griffin family, the mother who loved her children and managed her husband and maintained the household and was, in general, the competent emotional intelligence at the heart of a family that would otherwise be in complete chaos. This description is not wrong, but it is not complete. The complete picture of Lois Griffin is one of the most interesting things in the show's entire mythology, and it is built from details that are scattered across many seasons, delivered in the show's characteristic mode of burying the emotionally significant revelations in episodes that are nominally about something else. If you assemble all of these details carefully, if you treat the Lois lore as a coherent body of material rather than as isolated comedy bits, what you get is a portrait of a woman of extraordinary capability, complicated history, and genuine darkness, who has chosen to channel all of that into the life of a suburban housewife in ways that the show recognizes at its best as both a constraint and a choice. Let's begin with the Pewterschmidt family, because you cannot understand Lois without understanding where she comes from. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father, is one of the wealthiest men in New England. The show has been inconsistent about the precise scale of his wealth, as it has been inconsistent about many things. But the consistent picture is of a man of extraordinary financial power, of significant social influence, and of a personality that is best described as casually, systematically ruthless. Carter Pewterschmidt does not understand the world primarily in terms of relationships or feelings or moral considerations. He understands it in terms of power, who has it, who does not, how it can be acquired, and how it can be protected. He has raised his children, including Lois, in an environment defined by these priorities, and the imprint of that environment is visible in Lois in ways that the show has occasionally made very explicit. Barbara Pewterschmidt, Lois's mother, is a different kind of complicated. The show reveals, in one of its most genuinely surprising backstory revelations, that Barbara was a survivor, that she experienced, in her history, trauma of the kind that leaves permanent marks on a person's psychology, and that shapes the family they build and the children they raise. The precise nature of what Barbara survived is handled with varying levels of directness across the episodes that address it. But the central point is consistent. Barbara Pewterschmidt is not simply the decorative wife of a wealthy man. She is a person who survived something profound and who built, around that survival, a persona of social perfection that functions in the same way that Stewie's British accent functions, as protection, as construction, as the visible surface of a self that the real self can hide behind. Lois grew up in this household. She grew up watching her father's ruthlessness and her mother's performance of perfection, and she absorbed both. The question is what she did with what she absorbed. What she appears to have done, the interpretation that the show's lore most consistently supports, is choose. She chose, as a young woman, to leave the Pewterschmidt world. She chose Peter Griffin, a man who had nothing, no money, no social standing, no particularly obvious virtues that would recommend him to the daughter of one of New England's wealthiest families. She chose him, the show implies, specifically because he was nothing like her father. Because a man who is large and loud and uncomplicated and who loves you with the uncritical, uncalculating enthusiasm of someone who cannot quite believe his luck is. If you grew up in a household defined by calculated power, the most radical departure from everything you were taught to want. This choice, the choice of Peter, the choice of Spooner Street, the choice of the middle-class domestic life over the Pewterschmidt inheritance and influence, is usually framed in the show as evidence of Lois's fundamental decency. She chose love over money. She chose authenticity over status. And this is a real thing about Lois, but it is not the whole thing, because Lois did not leave her Pewterschmidt training behind. You cannot leave behind the fundamental toolkit of the way you were raised to navigate the world simply by changing your address. What Lois left behind was the context in which that toolkit operated. The wealth, the social milieu, the specific application of Carter's ruthlessness to the acquisition and maintenance of financial power. But the capabilities themselves, the strategic intelligence, the ability to read people and situations and identify leverage points, the willingness to do what is necessary to protect what matters to her, those came with her to Spooner Street. And the show has, in some of its most memorable episodes, allowed those capabilities to surface. The most discussed single example is the revelation of Lois's martial arts competence. Lois Griffin, the suburban housewife and mother of three, is a trained and highly capable fighter. The show has shown this repeatedly. Moments in which situations that should, by the established dynamics of the show, be resolved by Peter or by someone else, are resolved instead by Lois deploying a level of physical capability that her usual presentation completely conceals. Where did she learn to fight? The show gives partial answers in various episodes, connecting the martial arts training to periods of her life that occurred before the domestic frame of the series. Periods that are invoked but never fully explored, that exist as shadows behind the Lois we see rather than as fully realized backstory. But the fighting is almost a smaller mystery than the more fundamental question it raises. What else is Lois capable of that she does not show? What is she holding in reserve behind the patient wife and competent mother that she has decided, for reasons that the show gestures toward but never fully examines, not to deploy in the context of her current life? Then there is the Pewterschmidt family secret that takes the form of Patrick Pewterschmidt, Lois's brother, a man who was removed from the family and institutionalized when Lois was young, who appears in the show as a deeply damaged person whose damage connects directly to the particular pathologies of the Pewterschmidt family. Patrick's history is dark in ways that implicate the family's wealth and its use, ways that suggest Carter Pewterschmidt's ruthlessness extended into his family management in directions that the show depicts as having caused genuine and lasting harm. Lois grew up in a family that contained Patrick's story. She knew, on some level, what the Pewterschmidt wealth and power had done to her brother, and she chose, still, to build her life as far from that world as she could manage, which suggests that her reasons for marrying Peter and moving to Spooner Street were not simply romantic. They were, at some level, a response to having seen up close what the alternative looked like. There is also the matter of the pornographic film, which the show addresses directly in a storyline that is handled with more psychological sophistication than the subject matter might suggest. Lois, before her marriage, appeared in an adult film. This is revealed in the show not as a source of shame, but as a source of complicated feeling. As something that Lois made a choice to do for reasons that connect to the specific pressures of being a Pewterschmidt daughter in a world that had very specific ideas about what a Pewterschmidt daughter should be. The film was an act of autonomy. It was a way of asserting control over her own body and her own narrative in a context where both were heavily managed by family expectation and social pressure. It was, in the language of contemporary psychology, an assertion of agency against a framework that did not routinely grant her agency. What is interesting about how Lois relates to this revelation, when it surfaces, is not shame. She does not feel the simple, uncomplicated shame that a more moralistic treatment of the material would give her. What she feels is more complex. She feels the defensiveness of a person whose autonomy has been intruded upon. She feels the complicated pride of a person who made a choice that was, by the standards of the world she inhabited, transgressive, and who does not fully regret the transgression. And she feels, underneath both of these, the sadness of a person who understands that the choice, whatever its psychological value at the time, exists now as material that other people can use against her. That the assertion of autonomy has become, in the hands of the world, a weapon that can be pointed back at the person who wielded it. The mystery of Lois Griffin is the mystery of capacity and containment. She is a person who, by almost any measure, has more capability than her life requires. She is smarter than the situations she is put in demand. She is more emotionally sophisticated than the family dynamics she navigates daily call for. She is physically capable in ways that she rarely needs to demonstrate. She is, in the language of the Pewterschmidt world she was raised in, formidable. And she has chosen, deliberately and with full understanding of what she is choosing, to deploy that formidability in the service of a quiet domestic life on a street in a mid-sized New England city. Is this fulfilling? The show has never been willing to answer this question directly, because the answer is too complicated to fit within the comedy format without threatening to overwhelm it. But the question is always present. It is present in the episodes where Lois does something that surprises even Peter with its competence and directness. It is present in the episodes where Lois's restraint, her choice not to deploy her full capability, has visible cost. It is present most of all in the episodes where something cracks in the performance of patient domestic competence and something raw shows through, something that looks like frustration or grief or the specific ache of a person who has voluntarily made themselves smaller than they are and who, at moments, feels the shape of what they have set aside. Lois Griffin loves her family. This is the most true thing about her, and the show's best episodes know this and honor it. But loving your family and being fully yourself are not always the same project. And the distance between them is where the most interesting things about Lois Griffin live. Section 6. Meg Griffin and the long mystery of why there is a running joke in the show that has persisted across more than 2 decades. And it is the kind of running joke that, the longer it runs, becomes something different from what it started as. The joke is that Meg Griffin is unloved. The joke is that her family finds her embarrassing, that her peers find her undesirable, that the universe of the show has in some generalized and impersonal way decided that Meg Griffin is someone to whom bad things happen and at whose expense jokes can comfortably be made. This is the joke. This is the established premise. But here's the thing about a joke that runs for over 20 years. It stops being a joke. Or rather, it becomes something more than a joke. It becomes a question, a real and serious question. Why? Why is Meg the designated recipient of her family's disregard? Why has the show constructed its universe such that she occupies this particular position? And, most importantly, who is Meg Griffin when the joke is stripped away? Let's start with the role she plays in the family's psychology, because this is where the show has done some of its most sophisticated, if also most uncomfortable, work. There is an episode called Seahorse Seashell Party that is, by general agreement among people who watch the show carefully, one of the most formally ambitious things it has ever done. The episode's B-plot, if it can even be called that, given how much weight the show gives it, involves a storm that traps the Griffin family in the house together, and which results in a confrontation between Meg and the rest of her family that is not played for laughs. Not primarily. It is played to an unusual degree for emotional honesty. In the confrontation, Meg enumerates, with specificity and clarity and something close to controlled anguish, the ways in which her family has failed her. She names them. She refuses the frame of the joke. She insists in a sequence that is remarkable for its directness, on being taken seriously, on having the reality of her experience acknowledged rather than absorbed into the comedy of her family's dysfunction, and spat back out as another punchline at her expense. And the family's response to this confrontation is, at first, exactly what you would expect and dread. Peter becomes defensive. Chris becomes childish. Lois is uncomfortable. The family reaches for the familiar tools of their dynamic: dismissal, deflection, the humor that protects them from having to actually be with each other's pain. But then something shifts, and the shift is the most interesting thing in the episode. Meg concludes the confrontation not with triumph, not with the vindication you might expect from a story in which the long-suffering character finally speaks her truth. Instead, she concludes it with something much stranger and much sadder. She takes it back. Not because she was wrong, not because her family persuaded her that her experience was not real, but because she understands something about the family's psychology that she has perhaps always understood. She understands that she serves a function, that her role as the family's designated punching bag, the person at whom the family's collective anxiety, frustration, and self-disappointment gets aimed, is a load-bearing element of the family's structure. If she removes herself from that role, if she insists on being treated as a full human being with feelings that count, the family's dysfunction does not disappear. It simply finds another target. And the other targets, Peter or Chris or even Lois, are less equipped to survive being the target than Meg is. This is what Meg understands. She survives being the family's punching bag because she is, in the quiet that the show rarely acknowledges, the strongest person in the house. She takes the punishment so that the others don't have to. And she does this not because she doesn't know she's doing it, but because, and this is the part that breaks your heart if you let it, she loves them. She loves them in the particular way that you love flawed, difficult people when you have decided that their survival matters more than your own comfort. The show has acknowledged this, and the acknowledgement is one of the most significant things it has ever done. In the framing of Seahorse Seashell Party, Meg is described effectively as the lightning rod, the thing that absorbs the electricity of the family's collective dysfunction and grounds it so that the rest of the house doesn't burn down. This framing is not comfortable. It is not triumphant. But it is honest in a way that many long-running shows cannot afford to be about the characters they have historically mistreated. Now, let's ask the question that the show has raised and then typically declined to pursue. Why Meg? Why was Meg selected for this role? Was it a choice made by the family before she was old enough to consent to it? Was it simply the accident of being the oldest child, the first to be available when the family needed a target? Or is there something specific about Meg's nature, some quality of her character or her psychology, that made her both available and capable of serving this function? The show has, across various episodes, hinted at answers to these questions. There are episodes that suggest Meg's relationship with Lois is more complicated than the surface depiction suggests, that Lois has, on some level, redirected toward Meg certain of her own unresolved feelings about being a Pewterschmidt daughter, about the costs of the choices she made, about the parts of herself she set aside to build the life on Spooner Street. Lois's treatment of Meg is not simply casual indifference. At moments, it has the specific quality of a complicated projection, of a mother putting onto her daughter something that belongs to the mother herself, something she cannot quite confront in its original form. And there are episodes. The show's crossover with The Simpsons is an interesting case study here, where Meg is removed from the specific context of the Griffin family dynamics and is treated by characters who do not have the established habit of dismissing her as a normal person. The Simpsons episode's treatment of Meg is not the central story of that episode, but it is notable. In the context of Springfield, among people who are meeting her for the first time, Meg is not the butt of every joke. She is a teenager, she has opinions, she is capable of forming connections. This suggests that Meg's designated position in the Griffin family is genuinely specific to that context, that it is not some essential quality of who she is but a role that the family dynamic has assigned to her, which she has accepted because the alternative seems worse. And this is, when you sit with it, genuinely hopeful. It means that the Meg who exists in the family's most diminished version of her is not the whole Meg. It means there is a Meg who is in contexts where the family's projections are not landing on her. Someone quite different, naive, someone stronger and more capable and more present than the family's treatment of her would suggest. The deepest mystery of Meg Griffin is the question of what she will do when she leaves Spooner Street. The show has, in future set episodes and in episodes that gesture toward the characters' futures, been inconsistent about this, as it has been inconsistent about most things regarding the futures of its characters. But the Meg mystery is the mystery of deferred selfhood. She is a person who has postponed the question of who she is because the immediate demands of her family's dysfunction have made that postponement feel necessary and even generous. But the postponement cannot last forever. The question of who Meg Griffin actually is, beneath the role of the family's designated scapegoat, beneath the joke, beneath the specific damage that 20 years of being the lightning rod has inevitably caused, that question is going to have an answer. Someday. In a room where her family is not watching, in a context where the established dynamics do not apply, Meg Griffin is going to discover who she is. The show has never had the courage to show us that discovery. But the lore consistently implies that it will be remarkable. Section 7. Quagmire and the weight of what he carries. Glenn Quagmire is the neighbor. He lives across the street, or possibly next door. The show is, characteristically, inconsistent about the precise geography of the relationship between the Griffin and Quagmire households. He is Peter's friend. He is a commercial airline pilot. He has an extraordinarily active sexual history that the show has treated across most of its run as its primary source of comedy in the Quagmire character. He says a specific catchphrase. He has a distinctive physical design. He is, in the shorthand of the show's ensemble, the sex joke character. This is the surface. The surface is not the interesting part. The interesting part of Glenn Quagmire begins with a number. The number is 61. According to an episode that the show presented as a canonical revelation of Quagmire's true age, Glenn Quagmire was born in 1947, which, at the time the episode aired, made him 61 years old. Not the middle-aged man he appears to be, but someone substantially older, someone who has been inhabiting the body and the social context of a man in his 30s or 40s for far longer than biology would typically allow. The show's explanation for this, that he had various surgeries and treatments that maintain his apparent youthfulness, is delivered in the spirit of comedy, but the implication is striking. Glenn Quagmire has been working very hard to appear to be something other than what he is. Why? Why would a man in his 60s invest in the elaborate maintenance of an appearance of youth? The comedic answer is obvious. The sexual premise of his character requires him to be attractive to younger women. But the psychological answer is more interesting and more disturbing. A person who refuses to age, who invests enormous resources in presenting a younger self to the world, is a person who has something specific to run from. Is the acknowledgement of the passage of time. And the passage of time brings with of it the accumulated weight of everything that has happened. If you refuse to age, you are in some sense refusing to carry that weight. You are trying to stay in a place before the weight accumulated. What is Quagmire running from? The show tells us in episodes that are among the darkest in its history, dark in ways that sit very uncomfortably alongside the comedy of the character, in ways that the show has never fully reconciled, but that are in the text regardless. Quagmire's relationship to sex, and specifically to women, is not simply a character trait, it has a history. And the history involves, in ways the show handles with varying degrees of directness, experiences from his childhood and early life that shaped his relationship to intimacy, to consent, and to the specific forms of connection and disconnection that his sexual behavior represents. There is an episode in which Quagmire's father is revealed to be a person of extraordinary ethical complication, a person whose own behavior with regard to consent and sexuality was severely problematic, and who represents both a model for and a source of deep shame in Quagmire's understanding of himself. The revelation of who Quagmire's father is does not exonerate Quagmire for his own behavior. The show is careful about this, but it contextualizes his behavior in a way that makes the comedy of Quagmire is the sex joke character considerably more difficult to laugh at cleanly if you understand the background. And then there is his sister. Quagmire has a sister who appears in the show in circumstances that constitute, by any reasonable definition, one of the show's most genuinely serious dramatic storylines. The circumstances involve abuse, severe, prolonged abuse at the hands of a partner. The episode in which this is addressed is remarkable for the show's willingness to sit with the material without immediately deflecting into comedy. There are comedic elements, because there always are, but the core of the storyline is played with a seriousness that the show reserves for very few things. Quagmire's response to his sister's situation, the way he moves from the bystander position to something much more active and much more decisive, in a way that costs him something real and that the show treats as having cost him something real, reveals a dimension of his character that the sex joke premise almost entirely conceals. He is a person who, when someone he loves is genuinely in danger, is capable of extraordinary resolve. The comedy version of Quagmire is a man who pursues pleasure with single-minded focus and no apparent internal conflict. The episode with his sister reveals a man who is capable of doing something very serious for a very serious reason. These two Quagmires, the comedy one, and the one with the sister and the complicated father, and the age he is hiding and the weight he carries, do not coexist easily. The show has never fully reconciled them, and probably cannot, within its format, fully reconcile them. But the existence of both of them is one of the most interesting aspects of the show's treatment of its ensemble characters. The mystery of Glenn Quagmire is the mystery of the joke that has swallowed the person. He began as a comedy construction, the sex joke made ambulatory, and became, through the accumulation of backstory and dramatic material, something much more complicated. He became a person whose humor is, like Brian's drinking, a management strategy, a way of keeping at bay the things in his history that, if he looked at them directly, would require him to be a fundamentally different kind of person than he has chosen to be. Because being the joke is easier than being the person who has to reckon with what the joke is covering. Is Quagmire aware of this? The show has, on a few remarkable occasions, suggested that he might be that beneath the catchphrase and the permanent leer and the 61 years of aggressively maintained youthfulness, there is a Quagmire who can see himself with some clarity, and who finds what he sees uncomfortable enough that he keeps the comedy running very, very loudly to drown out the view. His friendship with Peter Griffin is, within this frame, interesting. Quagmire has expressed, in moments of uncharacteristic honesty, a complicated and largely negative view of Brian Griffin. A view that the show has sometimes framed as jealousy. Both of them love Lois in their respective ways. But that contains, on reflection, something more interesting. Quagmire's particular problem with Brian Griffin is, in part, the problem of the mirror. Brian is another person who has built an elaborate persona over a deeply uncomfortable internal reality. And Quagmire can see through the persona because he has his own. The irritation he feels toward Brian may be, at its root, the irritation of recognition, the discomfort of seeing your own coping mechanism reflected back at you in someone else's form. What Quagmire would be if he put down the joke, if he stopped running from 61 years of accumulated experience. This is one of the show's genuinely open mysteries. The show has never been willing to find out, because the finding out would require a kind of sustained honesty that the comedy format does not accommodate. But the possibility of that other Quagmire, the one the jokes are covering, is one of the most interesting ghosts on Spooner Street. Section 8. The Town That Shouldn't Exist. Let us turn our attention away from the people for a moment and look at the place itself, because the place is its own kind of mystery. And it is a mystery that operates on a different register from the psychological mysteries of the characters. This is a topological mystery, a cartographic impossibility. The question of where exactly this town is, and whether the answer to that question makes any sense at all. The town in which the Griffins live is located, supposedly, in Newport County, Rhode Island. This is established in the show's dialogue and in various visual and contextual cues across hundreds of episodes. The town has, over the years of the show's run, been identified as being adjacent to or near the city of Providence. It has been depicted as a coastal town with access to the ocean. It has been shown as being surrounded by the specific landscape of southern New England, the particular combination of dense forest, rocky coastline, and dense suburban development that characterizes that part of the country. All of this is internally consistent enough. The problem arises when you start to apply real geography to the fictional town's implied geography, and the problem, once you see it, is difficult to unsee. Newport County, Rhode Island is in the southeastern part of the state. It is not adjacent to Providence in any direction that makes geographic sense. Providence is in Providence County, separated from Newport County by the Narragansett Bay and several intermediate municipalities. A town in Newport County cannot, without a very significant commute, be near Providence in the casual way the show treats proximity. And the town's coastal geography, the specific way the ocean is positioned relative to the town's commercial district, residential neighborhoods, and major landmarks, does not match any possible location in Newport County with any consistency. The highway access is wrong. The train service that occasionally appears is wrong. The proximity to Boston, which the show invokes for various purposes, is wrong for Newport County and would be less wrong for a location significantly north of where the show says the town is. The flight times from the town's airport to various domestic and international destinations are wrong for Rhode Island generally, suggesting either a level of geographic carelessness in the writing room or a systematic attempt to give the impression of Rhode Island without actually being constrained by Rhode Island's actual geography. This is the surface level of the geographic mystery. The simple observation that the place as described doesn't quite line up with any real location in Rhode Island. But there is a deeper level that is more interesting. The deeper level is this. The town's geography is not simply inconsistent with real geography. It is also internally inconsistent. The position of the Griffins' house relative to their neighbors, the position of the commercial district relative to the residential neighborhoods, the location of the school, and the church and the brewery where Peter works. These are not consistent within the show's own established universe. They shift. The Quagmire house is, depending on the episode, across the street from the Griffins or next door. The bar where Peter and his friends drink is, depending on the episode, a short walk from the house or a significant drive. The routes between familiar landmarks in the show do not, when you attempt to trace them, produce a coherent map. Many long-running shows have this problem. Continuity errors accumulate. Sets are redressed. The geography of a fictional place gets handled by different writers and directors over decades, and the inconsistencies pile up. This is the simple explanation, and it is, again, certainly partly true. But the interesting question is whether the geographic incoherence of this particular town is entirely accidental, or whether it has accumulated into something that functions at a certain level of awareness as a feature of the town's nature rather than simply a flaw in the show's continuity. What if the town is geographically inconsistent because it is not quite a real place? What if it is a construction? Not in the sense of being a fictional setting for a TV show, which of course it is, but in the sense of being a fictional construction within its own narrative. A place that exists as an idea of a place rather than as a coherent geographic entity. This reading connects to something that fan theorists have explored with considerable depth. The idea that the universe of the show is in some meaningful sense a subjective rather than an objective one. That the town exists as it is experienced by the people in it rather than as an objective geographic reality. That its inconsistencies are not errors but symptoms. Symptoms of the fact that the place is being held together by the shared imagination of the people who live there. And that imagination, being human and imperfect and inconsistent, does not produce a perfectly coherent geography. This is an abstract theory, and the show does not explicitly endorse it. But the show does, periodically, draw attention to the strangeness of the place in ways that feel like something more than incidental. There are jokes in the show about the town's impossibility, meta jokes, the kind the show makes about its own nature and its own inconsistencies. These jokes are not just self-deprecation. They are, in the tradition of the best self-aware fiction, acknowledgments of the specific reality of the universe being depicted. A universe that is strange, that does not quite follow normal rules, that has a particular quality of suspension and impossibility, that is not simply carelessness but is something that belongs to the place itself. The town should not exist, and yet here we are, walking its streets at midnight, and the streets are very real in the particular way that impossible places are always real. Real in the feeling they produce. Real in the specific texture of their darkness and their silence. Real in the way they accommodate the people who live in them and the questions those people carry. What makes a place real? The most obvious answer is geography. Coordinates on a map, a specific relationship to other specific places, the kind of reality you can verify with a ruler and a compass. But there is another kind of reality, and it is the kind that the show's universe possesses in abundance. The reality of emotional significance, of accumulated story, of the specific way that a place becomes real through the lives that have been lived in it. By that measure, this fictional street is among the most real places in American popular culture. The events that have occurred here, the reunions and separations, the revelations and concealments, the small moments of genuine love and the large moments of spectacular dysfunction, have accumulated into a place that, even if you cannot locate it on any real map of Rhode Island, feels deeply familiar, deeply inhabited. The geographic impossibility is, in this light, not a flaw. It is perhaps the truest thing about the town, the acknowledgement that places that matter do not have to be mappable. They just have to be somewhere that people keep coming home to. And the Griffins, for all their dysfunction, for all the darkness and the commodity and the accumulated weight of 20-plus years of episodes, keep coming home to Spooner Street. There must be something here worth coming home to. Section 9. Death, Resurrection, and the Impossible Permanence of Spooner Street. There is a specific kind of storytelling that long-running television shows develop when they have been on long enough. A relationship to death and consequence that is fundamentally different from the relationship that limited-run stories have. In a story with a fixed ending, death means something. It is permanent. It is the final punctuation of a character arc, the moment beyond which the story cannot go for that particular person. But in a show that has been running for 25 years and has no clear ending on the horizon, death cannot mean the same thing. It cannot be final, because finality would remove from the show characters whose continued existence is commercially and narratively necessary. And so shows like this one develop their own specific mythology around death. One that accommodates the fact that characters die and are then not dead, that the grief of loss is real and then is retroactively undone, that the permanence of endings is something the universe of the show resists at a structural level. No single event in the show's history illustrates this mythology more clearly than the death of Brian Griffin in the 12th season. Brian was hit by a car. The show treated this as genuinely final in a way that it has rarely treated anything. It gave the death weight, it gave the family's response to the death emotional reality. It gave the grief that Stewie experienced in the aftermath a depth and a sincerity that surprised people who had been watching the show casually. A new dog named Vinny was introduced to fill the physical and social space that Brian's absence had created. The household continued. The family adapted, as families do, to the presence of a new member who was not the member they had lost. And then, 2 episodes later, Stewie used his time machine to go back to the moment of the accident and prevent it. Brian came back. Vinny was unhappened. The grief was undone. The death was, in the language of narrative structure, retconned, acknowledged, and then removed from the official record, relegated to the status of something that happened in a version of events that the story has chosen not to carry forward. The fan response to this sequence of events was, famously, intense. People were genuinely moved by Brian's death. They organized in the specific way that internet communities organize around shared feeling, around the loss of a character who had, for them, been a consistent presence for years. And then the reversal was experienced by those same people as a betrayal, not simply as a plot disappointment, but as a specific kind of emotional manipulation, the kind where real feelings are elicited and then the eliciting is denied. The criticism is fair, and the show has, in various ways, acknowledged it, not apologized for it, but acknowledged it in the meta-aware way that the show acknowledges most things about its own problematic patterns, which is to make jokes about the acknowledgement rather than to change the behavior being acknowledged. But what is interesting for our purposes tonight is not the ethics of the storytelling decision, but what the decision reveals about the show's mythology. Because Brian's death and resurrection is not an isolated anomaly, it is the most dramatic instance of a pattern that runs throughout the show's entire run, a pattern of events that appear to be permanent and then turn out not to be, of deaths and departures and transformations that the show treats as final until it decides it needs them to be undone, at which point it undoes them. Cleveland Brown left Spooner Street. He went to Virginia and started a new life. The show followed him, literally created a spin-off that depicted his life in that new context, a spin-off that ran for 4 seasons and developed Cleveland into a character with considerably more depth and autonomy than he had had in his role as one of Peter's bar companions. And then Cleveland came back. The spin-off ended, and Cleveland returned to Spooner Street and the friendships and dynamics he had left behind. And the show resumed as though the departure had not accumulated the weight of 4 years' worth of separate development that would, in any realistic psychological portrait of a person, have changed him. It did not change him. Or rather, the changes that his time in Virginia might plausibly have produced in him were not carried forward into his resumed life on Spooner Street. He returned to the bar. He resumed his role in the ensemble. The 4 years were acknowledged in a practical sense, but not in a psychological one. Cleveland Brown did not come back from Virginia as a meaningfully different person from the one who left. This is the pattern. This is what the show does with departure and return, with death and resurrection. It preserves the emotional intensity of the original event. The death feels real. The departure feels real. The transformation feels real, while ultimately refusing to let any of these events produce permanent change. The status quo is at the deepest level inviolable. Characters can die, but they come back. Characters can leave, but they return. Characters can change dramatically, but the changed version of them eventually drifts back toward the baseline that the show needs them to occupy in order to continue being itself. What does this pattern mean? Is it simply a commercial necessity? The reality that a show running indefinitely cannot afford to permanently remove the assets that constitute its ongoing value? Yes, partly. But there is something more interesting than pure commerce happening when you look at the pattern in its totality. The pattern says something about the show's relationship to time, and specifically to loss. The show cannot tolerate permanent loss. It can depict it. It can produce the full emotional experience of loss, with the weight and the grief and the darkness that real loss involves, but it cannot allow that loss to stick. Every death leads to a resurrection. Every departure leads to a return. The permanent ending, the event that cannot be undone, is something the show treats as inadmissible at the level of its own structure. In a universe where this is the case, where death is reversible and departure is temporary, and change is always ultimately overcome by the pull of the original state, what does it mean to experience grief? The characters grieve. Stewie's grief over Brian is depicted as genuine and is, at moments, genuinely devastating to watch. But the grief is always, in retrospect, premature. The person who is lost comes back. The grief was real, but the loss that produced it was not final. And the retroactive not finality of the loss retroactively changes the nature of the grief itself, gives it a quality of having been spent on something that ultimately did not require it. This could be read as cruel, as the show manipulating its audience's emotional responses for short-term ratings purposes, and then refusing to honor those responses by actually committing to the losses it depicts. But it can also be read as something more philosophically interesting, as the show insisting, at the level of its own structure, that this particular family, in this particular house, on this particular impossible street, cannot finally be separated. That the gravitational pull of Spooner Street, the specific quality of belonging to this place and this family, is so strong that it overcomes even death. The Griffins cannot be permanently removed from each other. Brian could not permanently die. Cleveland could not permanently leave. The family could not permanently fracture. The street holds them. Something about this place, about the specific gravity of this house and these relationships, keeps returning everyone to the starting point. Not unchanged, not without the weight of what happened, but here, present, together. Is that comfort? Is that tragedy? Is it both simultaneously? The show has never decided, and the not deciding is itself the most honest thing it could do. Section 10. Fan theories that might actually be true. There is a category of engagement with long-running stories that has become one of the most interesting forms of participatory culture in the age of the internet. The fan theory. The sustained, evidence-based argument that the official story is, beneath its surface, telling a different story, one that the creators may or may not have intended, but that the text supports if you read it carefully enough. Fan theories exist for almost every significant piece of popular culture that has been around long enough to develop a dedicated community of close readers. But few shows have generated fan theories as rich, as structurally sophisticated, or as genuinely disturbing as this one. There are theories about this fictional street that are, frankly, hard to dismiss once you have encountered them. Theories that use evidence from the show, specific episodes, specific lines of dialogue, specific visual details, to construct arguments about the nature of the universe the show depicts. Theories that, if true, would transform the show from a long-running animated comedy into something considerably darker and more complicated. And theories that, even if not literally true in the show's official canon, feel true in the way that the best critical insights feel true, as though they have identified something real about the underlying structure of the thing they are examining, even if that structure was not consciously constructed by the people who made it. Let us go through some of the most compelling ones, with the care and attention they deserve. The first theory we need to examine is the one that has been called in various online discussions the Peters coma theory or the mental institution theory. It is also, in some formulations, the Meg and Chris died in a car crash theory, though these are different versions of the same underlying argument. The core claim of the theory is this. At some point in the show's timeline, early in the run, possibly before it even officially begins, Peter Griffin experienced a catastrophic event that resulted in either his death or his hospitalization in a psychiatric facility or his entry into a persistent coma. And the show, the entirety of the show as we have experienced it, is either Peter's dying vision or his institutionalized fantasy or his coma dream. The evidence the theory marshals is, when you assemble it, surprising in its specificity and its coherence. The town's geographic impossibility, which we discussed at length in the previous section, is cited as evidence of a constructed rather than real environment, the kind of environment that a dreaming or fantasizing mind produces, in which the overall impression is coherent, but the details, examined closely, don't hold together. The character's immunity to aging and consequence is cited as the behavior of dream figures rather than real people, fixed in their essential qualities, unable to fundamentally change, preserved in amber in a way that real people never are. The reset mechanism, the way the show returns all its characters to their baseline after each episode, no matter how dramatic the events of that episode, is cited as the behavior of a mind that cannot allow its vision to evolve, that keeps returning to the same essential scene because the essential scene is what the mind needs to see in order to maintain whatever the vision is providing. In the most dramatic version of the theory, the specific trauma that precipitated Peter's condition is identified. It involves the deaths of Meg and Chris in an automobile accident for which Peter's driving was responsible. In this version, the show is Peter's inability to process the deaths of his children, his mind's construction of a world in which Meg and Chris are alive, are present, are frustrating and boring and annoying and beloved. In this version, the show's treatment of Meg, the designated object of the family's contempt, the character who is consistently punished and humiliated, is Peter's unconscious guilt made visible. He cannot love Meg properly in the dream because loving her properly would mean confronting the fact that he failed her in reality. The contempt is not the show's actual attitude toward Meg. It is Peter's projected self-hatred, routed through the dream Meg, because the real Meg is someone whose death he cannot directly acknowledge. This is an extraordinarily bleak reading of a show that is nominally a comedy, and the show does not, in any official capacity, endorse it. But the theory's evidence is not nothing. The show has, in its most introspective moments, depicted Peter as a man who is haunted by something he cannot fully articulate, a weight that sits beneath the comedy, a darkness that the comedy is perpetually working to cover. If the coma theory is not literally true, it may still be emotionally true in the way that the best metaphors are true. It captures something real about the quality of Peter Griffin's experience, even if it describes that experience in narrative terms the official show would reject. The second major theory worth examining operates at a different level of scale. It concerns not Peter's individual psychology, but the nature of the show's universe itself, and it makes a claim about what the show's history of cancellations and returns actually represents within the fiction. The argument goes like this. The show was canceled twice, canceled and then returned again. Within the fiction, within the world of Spooner Street and the Griffin family, these periods of cancellation are not acknowledged. The show simply resumes after the gap, the characters unchanged, the world intact, the storylines continuing as though nothing happened. But what if, within the show's own mythology, the cancellations did happen? What if the periods of non-existence were real in the show's universe? And what the show is depicting, when it returns from cancellation, is not the same universe it left, but a parallel universe, adjacent to the original one, in which the characters' lives have continued through the years of non-existence in ways the show never shows us? This theory draws support from the noticeable differences in tone, character behavior, and narrative content between the pre-cancellation seasons and the post-revival seasons. The changes are often cited critically as evidence of declining writing quality, and there is merit in that critique. But the parallel universe theory offers an alternative framing. The show that returned in 2005 is not the same show that was canceled light in 2002 because it is depicting a slightly different version of the universe. The characters are slightly different because they are different people. People who lived through 3 years that the show never depicted. People who accumulated experiences and changes that the show, rather than depicting directly, chose to absorb into a revised baseline. In this reading, some of the continuity inconsistencies between the early and revival seasons are not errors but evidence. Evidence of the discontinuity between universes, the small details that differ between the original version and the parallel one. The Brian who returned in 2005 is not quite the same Brian who was canceled in 2002 because he is from a slightly different branch of the story. He has the same name and the same general characteristics, but the 3 missing years produced in him small differences that accumulate across subsequent seasons into something that feels meaningfully different from what came before. This is a theory that takes the show's most commonly criticized feature, its inconsistency, and reframes it as a form of honest storytelling. The inconsistency is not sloppiness. It is the mark of the gap, the evidence of what the show did not depict, but acknowledges, structurally, having happened. The third theory we need to sit with tonight is the one that has been called the Brian is the narrator theory, though in more sophisticated formulations, it is better described as the Brian is the author theory. The basic claim? The universe of the show is not a third-party omniscient narration, but a first-person narration in which the narrator is Brian Griffin himself, writing about his own life and the lives of the people around him. The evidence for this theory begins with Brian's established character as a writer, a person who has been working on a novel for most of the show's run, who has subsequently published a memoir, who thinks about his experience in literary terms and who, of all the characters in the show, is most given to the kind of retrospective, reflective observation that characterizes literary narration. If Brian is writing about his life on Spooner Street, then the show is his manuscript, the draft of the book about his time with the Griffin family. What makes this theory interesting is what it says about the show's specific stylistic choices. The cutaway gags, the show's signature comedic device in which characters reference something and the narrative cuts away to depict it, are, in this reading, Brian's authorial digressions. They are the things he puts in the text that are not strictly necessary to the main story, but that he, as a writer, finds interesting or amusing. They are footnotes. They are the specific pleasure of a writer who has been given unlimited space to tell his story and who takes full advantage of that freedom to follow every tangential thought wherever it leads. The specific quality of Brian's omniscience in the show, the way the narrative sometimes follows his perspective more closely than any other characters, the way his observations often have the quality of retrospective wisdom rather than present moment confusion, is in this reading the tell. He knows how the stories end because he is telling them after the fact. He has the benefit of hindsight. He can describe Peter's foolishness with affectionate irony because he is writing about Peter from a distance, not experiencing Peter's foolishness in real time. If Brian is the author of the show's universe, then the show's inconsistencies, the geographic impossibility of the town, the character's immunity to aging, the reset mechanism, the deaths that turn out not to be final, are all Brian's authorial choices. He has constructed this world in a specific way, with specific rules, because those are the choices that best serve the story he is trying to tell. The story he is trying to tell is about family, about love, about the specific way that a household of deeply flawed people can constitute, for all its dysfunction, a home. The inconsistencies are not errors in his manuscript. They are the marks of his sensibility. The places where he chose story truth over literal truth, where he adjusted the facts to serve the feeling. This theory, like the coma theory, is not literally endorsed by the show, but it captures something real about the show's particular quality, about the way it feels, at its best, like a personal document rather than a manufactured product. Like someone is telling you about their life with all the warmth and exaggeration and occasional dishonesty that characterizes the stories we tell about ourselves and the people we love. There is one more theory that deserves examination tonight, and it is the one that is, in some ways, the most philosophically rich of all the ones we have considered. It has been called the consensual hallucination theory, though in the fan discussions it goes by various names. The argument is this: the fictional town, the impossible, inconsistently mapped, temporally suspended, death-defying universe of the show, exists because the characters collectively need it to exist. The town is not an objective reality. It is a shared imaginative construction maintained by the collective belief of the people who inhabit it, and the specific features of the town, its impossibility, its immunity to permanent change, its ability to accommodate death and return and departure and reunion, are not failures of realism, but features of a reality that operates according to different rules from the one you and I inhabit. Rules that serve the specific needs of the people who live there. In this reading, the town exists because the Griffins need it to exist. Because somewhere in the psychology of each of them, there is a need for this specific place. This impossible, inconsistent, warm, and terrible and funny and dark house on this unmappable street in this Rhode Island that doesn't quite exist, to be real. And their collective need is strong enough to make it real, in the particular way that very powerful shared imaginative needs make things real. Not real in the sense of being verifiable by external measurement. Real in the sense of being genuinely present, genuinely inhabited, genuinely capable of containing the full weight of the lives being lived in it. The town that shouldn't exist exists because the people who need it won't let it not exist. That is not a logical argument. It is a psychological one, and the show's universe, examined carefully, is ultimately a psychological rather than a logical construction. It obeys the rules of feeling rather than the rules of physics. It accommodates what the characters need it to accommodate. It resists what the characters cannot afford to lose. Is that magic? Is that delusion? Is it the specific reality that love creates, when it is strong enough to insist on the continued existence of the things it cannot bear to lose? The show has never answered this question directly, but the question is in there, underneath all the jokes, underneath all the cutaway gags and the running references and the comedy that fills the air like static. The question of what holds this place together, of why it refuses to simply end. And the answer, when you sit with it long enough in the dark, is quieter than you might expect. Section 11. The crossovers and what they reveal about the larger universe. A show that has been running for 25 years accumulates, among other things, relationships with other shows. It develops the particular kind of institutional memory that makes crossover storytelling possible. The awareness that there are other universes adjacent to your own, other fictional worlds that exist on a similar plane of reality, and that the boundaries between those worlds are, under certain conditions, permeable. This fictional street has, over the course of its run, crossed into several other fictional universes. Each of these crossovers is interesting not just as a formal exercise in shared universe building, but as a piece of mythology in its own right. A moment when the show's universe was tested against another universe, and the contact between them revealed something about both. The most significant crossover, the one that generated the most discussion and the most analysis, was the crossover with the Simpsons universe. An episode in which the Griffins traveled to Bud Springfield and encountered the Simpsons family was, by any measure, a remarkable piece of television. Not because it was perfect, it was not, but because it took two universes that had been in competitive relationship with each other for decades and placed them in direct contact for the first time. What the crossover revealed, most interestingly, was the specific nature of the difference between the two universes. The Simpsons universe and the Griffin universe are both animated family comedies set in fictional American towns. They are both built around a working-class family with an unintelligent father, a capable mother, and children at various stages of development. They are both long-running shows that have become cultural institutions. From the outside, they look like the same kind of thing. But in the crossover, when the characters of the two universes actually encounter each other, the difference in their realities becomes vivid. The Simpsons characters react to the Griffins with a discomfort that feels in the episode's comedy like the discomfort of encountering people from a significantly different cultural context. The Griffins are louder, more chaotic, more physically extreme. Their humor operates on different frequencies. Their family dynamics are recognizably similar, but somehow more intense, more overtly dysfunctional, more explicitly dark. What this reveals, in the specific terms of comparative mythology, is that these two universes, while adjacent, are operating under different sets of physical and social rules. Springfield is a place of somewhat more fundamental stability, a place where the insanity is more routinely contained within comedy conventions, where the consequences of actions are more predictably absorbed by the narrative. The Griffin universe is a place of higher intensity and lower stability, where the comedy is more extreme and the darkness, when it surfaces, is more genuinely dark. The crossover also gave us, in the subplot involving Meg and Lisa Simpson, one of the clearest views we have ever gotten of who Meg Griffin might be in a context where the specific pressures of her family's dynamic are not operating at full force. Lisa Simpson, meeting Meg for the first time, treats her as a peer. She engages with her seriously, she encourages her. And Meg, in this context, away from Spooner Street, in a universe that is not organized around her designated role as the family's scapegoat, responds to this treatment with a warmth and an openness that we rarely see in episodes set in her own universe. The Meg who interacts with Lisa Simpson is not the Meg of Seahorse Seashell Party. She is not the Meg who has absorbed years of family contempt and is working hard to carry it without being destroyed. She is something closer to who Meg would be if she had grown up in a context that saw her. She is, briefly and beautifully, herself. There is also the crossover with the American Dad universe, which is, in the show's own mythology, a universe created by the same person who created the Griffin universe, a sibling universe running on the same plane of animated reality. The contact between these two universes is different from the contact with the Simpsons universe because American Dad is not a competitor, but a relative. The Smith family and the Griffin family occupy the same kind of fictional space, produced by the same creative sensibility, reflecting different aspects of the same cultural and personal imagination. What is interesting about the occasional moments of crossover or reference between these two universes is the way the American Dad characters, when they appear in the Griffin universe, feel different from the native inhabitants, more grounded, more capable of consequence, as though they come from a place where the rules are slightly more rigorously enforced, where actions produce outcomes that accumulate, where characters are more definitively held accountable for the choices they make. This difference is, in the metacritical reading, a reflection of the different writing philosophies of the two shows. American Dad, from relatively early in its run, developed a commitment to story structure and character consequence that the Griffin show never quite matched. The American Dad universe is one in which the comedy serves the story rather than replacing it, in which the characters' choices have actual weight, in which the family's love for each other is expressed through actions that accumulate across episodes into something that resembles genuine relationship development. The Griffin universe, by contrast, is one in which the story serves the comedy, or in its less successful periods, in which the story is simply discarded in favor of the comedy, leaving the characters to move through a series of unconnected jokes without the connective tissue of ongoing consequence. When the American Dad characters appear in the Griffin universe, the contrast between their way of inhabiting narrative space and the Griffin's way of inhabiting it is visible as a kind of tonal dissonance. Two different storytelling philosophies meeting in the same fictional space and briefly making visible what distinguishes them. There are also the smaller, more oblique crossovers, the references to other fictional universes that appear in passing, in background details, or in brief jokes, suggesting that the show's universe is embedded in a larger multimedia reality. These micro crossovers are less interesting individually, but suggest collectively that the Griffin universe is not isolated, that it exists in a field of fictional spaces, each of them running adjacent to the others, separated by the specific gravity of their own storytelling conventions, but capable, under the right circumstances, of brief contact. What this larger universe means, what it says about the nature of the Griffin universe's reality, about how that reality relates to other fictional realities, and about the specific position that Spooner Street occupies in the broader geography of animated America, is a question the show has never fully explored. But it is present. The universe is not alone. And the loneliness of this specific impossible street in this specific impossible Rhode Island is perhaps slightly less complete for the awareness that other streets, in other cities, in other universes running on different rules, are also occupied by people trying to love each other imperfectly in the specific way that imperfect people do. Section 12. The Herbert Mystery. Comedy that refused to confront itself. There are characters in the show's long history who sit at the intersection of comedy and genuine discomfort in ways that the show has never fully resolved and likely never will. Herbert is one of these characters. He is an old man who lives in the neighborhood. He has a specific kind of interest in Chris Griffin that the show depicts, across many appearances, in ways that are understood to be comedic because they are telegraphed as comedy. The framing, the music, the response of other characters all signal that what you are watching is a joke. But underneath the comedic framing, what the show is depicting is not funny in any direct sense. It is the behavior of a predator. The joke is that the predatory behavior is being performed by someone who looks physically harmless, who speaks in a specific affected way that the show treats as inherently comic, and whose actual intentions are consistently readable to anyone watching, despite never being named directly. Herbert has become one of the show's longest-running recurring characters. He appeared first in Season 4 and has returned in dozens of episodes since. The show has, as it has developed him across the years, occasionally given him backstory, a history of military service, glimpses of a life before he became the neighborhood fixture he is. And these glimpses of backstory humanize him in ways that sit uncomfortably alongside the consistent framing of his primary characteristic as comedy. The mystery of Herbert, in the context of a careful examination of the show's lore, is not really about Herbert himself. It is about what the show chose to do with the character and what that choice reveals about the show's relationship to its own content. The show chose to make Herbert funny. It chose to surround his behavior with the signifiers of comedy in a way that allowed the audience to laugh without fully confronting what they were being asked to laugh at. This is a choice that the show has never revisited. Herbert has never been subject to the kind of formal acknowledgement that, say, the Meg storylines occasionally received, where the show made visible the fact that it understood the darkness of what it was depicting. Herbert is simply the neighbor. He is simply the running joke. And the mystery is why the show never chose to interrogate this particular running joke, why this specific form of discomfort received less critical self-examination from the writers than, for instance, the Brian Griffin character, who was explicitly called out for his behavior by other characters in ways that the show framed as meaningful criticism. Herbert never received this treatment. One could argue, the show's defenders have argued, that the character's comedy relies precisely on the unreality of what is being depicted, on the over-the-top theatrical quality of the character's presentation, which prevents the audience from reading him as a real-world type. The counter-argument is that 20-plus years of a character whose primary comedic function is the presentation of predatory behavior as broadly funny is a choice that has cultural effects regardless of the intent behind the framing. The show knows this on some level. It has always known it. There are moments in episodes involving Herbert where the usual comedy mechanics seem to hesitate, where the jokes around him feel slightly less assured, slightly more aware of their own difficulty than the show's usual confident comedy register. These moments of hesitation are not resolutions. They are not apologies or recontextualizations. They are simply the small visible sign that somewhere in the production of these episodes, someone paused and felt the weight of the question and then proceeded anyway. What does the continued existence of Herbert tell us about the show's relationship to its own discomfort? Partly it tells us something specific to this show and its history, to the particular writing culture it developed, to the specific ways in which the comedy machinery it built made certain things easy to continue doing even when the reasons to stop were present. But partly it tells us something about long-running comedies in general, about the way that jokes, once they have been made and found their audience, develop a momentum that is very difficult to reverse without acknowledging, explicitly and publicly, the reasons for the reversal. To stop doing Herbert would be to acknowledge that Herbert should not have been done. And that acknowledgement carries costs that the show has never been willing to pay. This is not an anomaly in the show's history. It is part of a pattern. The show has consistently chosen the momentum of the established joke over the cost of the honest reckoning. The Meg storylines ran for 10 years before the reckoning. The Brian character ran for years after the Quagmire speech without producing actual change. The Peter character drifted into genuine cruelty over many seasons before anyone in the production appeared to register it as a problem. The show has a specific relationship to its own discomfort, which is to acknowledge it in the language of comedy and then continue unchanged. Herbert is the clearest example of this relationship. He is the joke that never got its reckoning. And in the context of an examination of the show's mysteries, his continuous, unchallenged presence is a mystery of will. Not of what we don't know about the character, but of what the show chose not to confront about itself. Section 13. The Giant Chicken. Violence Without Weight. Among the show's various recurring devices and running jokes, the giant chicken occupies a specific and unusual position. He is not a metaphor, exactly, or at least the show has never explicitly framed him as a metaphor. But he functions like a metaphor, and the specific function he performs is one of the most revealing things the show has ever built into its mythology. The giant chicken, whose name is Ernie, though this is almost never relevant, has appeared in elaborate, extended fight sequences with Peter Griffin across multiple seasons. The fights are extraordinarily detailed and cinematically referential, staged with the kind of careful choreographic attention that the show's regular comedy sequences rarely receive. They escalate wildly, moving through environments that grow increasingly bizarre, involving damage that would, in any realistic context, be lethal many times over. And then they end, temporarily, and the show moves on, and the chicken is not dead, and Peter is not dead, and neither of them carries the wounds of what just happened into the next scene. The origin of the feud, Peter received a bad coupon from the chicken, which is the show's own explanation, offered without elaboration, is specifically designed to be comically inadequate. The disproportion between the cause, a bad coupon, and the effect, multi-episode, city-destroying physical confrontations, is the joke. The violence is enormous, and the reason for it is trivial. But sit with that disproportion for a moment longer than the comedy intends you to. A man and a giant chicken have been engaging in catastrophically destructive physical combat across many years over a bad coupon. Neither of them has resolved the original grievance. Neither of them has walked away. The violence keeps recurring, keeps escalating, keeps finding new settings and new opportunities for new damage, and nothing, not the passage of time, not the accumulation of injury, not the destruction of surrounding property and the implied harm to innocent bystanders, has made either combatant stop. This is, if you extract it from the comedy framing, a portrait of something that exists in the real world, and that the show is, whether it means to or not, depicting with some accuracy the specific psychology of the grudge that has outlasted its reasons. The feud between Peter and the chicken is the feud between people who no longer remember or fully believe in the original cause of their conflict, but who have been fighting so long that the fighting has become its own purpose. The violence sustains itself. The original coupon is irrelevant. What is relevant is the specific identity-sustaining quality of the ongoing conflict. The way each party's sense of themselves is now partly defined by their relationship to the other as enemy. The fact that neither combatant is permanently harmed, that the injuries of each fight are fully reversed by the next appearance, that the chicken can be apparently killed and then appear again in a subsequent season in apparently full health, is another instance of the show's mythology of impermanence. The violence has no weight because the universe of the show refuses to let violence have permanent weight. The chicken fight is spectacular, elaborate, cinematically detailed, and ultimately consequence-free. This is comedy, but it is also, in the terms of the show's larger mythology, a kind of theology. The universe of this show does not permit things to be permanently destroyed by violence. The violence can be intense. It can be detailed. It can be extended to extreme lengths. But at the end of it, everyone returns to their starting state. The chicken and Peter go home. The damage is undone, the feud continues until the next time. In a show that has sometimes been criticized for depicting violence in ways that seemed to treat real-world harm as trivial, the chicken fights function as the most honest expression of the show's actual relationship to violence. It is real within the confines of the gag, and it is unreal the moment the gag ends. It is, in the show's universe, theater. The audience and the characters alike understand it as theater. And this theatricality is not necessarily a failure of seriousness. It is a specific choice about what kind of universe this is. A universe in which spectacle and reality operate in different registers, and in which the spectacle can be as extreme as the creative team wishes, without accumulating into the specific kind of real-world gravity that would make it unsustainable. The giant chicken is, in this reading, the show's physical expression of its own mythology. He is what happens when the show asks the question, what if violence had no permanent consequences? He is the answer, running on its hind legs and throwing punches in a shopping mall, and he is both funny and, when you look at him long enough, a little unsettling. Section 14. The Theology of the Show. God, Death, and the Rules of the Afterlife. There are not many television shows that have depicted God as a recurring character, and there are fewer still that have depicted God in the specific way this show has. As a figure who is simultaneously omnipotent and casually irresponsible, who exists at the level of the show's comedy rather than at the level of its genuine spiritual inquiry, who appears in episodes not to offer wisdom or comfort or even challenge, but to participate in the general chaos of the universe as though the chaos is mildly entertaining to watch. The show's God is large and white-haired and speaks with an authority that is undercut consistently by the specific ways in which he uses that authority. He is not malicious, he is not absent. He is, in the show's particular theological vision, something closer to distracted. A being of enormous power who has, across the course of managing an entire universe, developed something like the casual irresponsibility of a person who has had their job for too long and has stopped taking it as seriously as they once did. This is a specific kind of theological statement. It is not atheism. The show does not deny God's existence, it depicts it directly and repeatedly. It is not traditional religious devotion. The God depicted is not one that traditional religious frameworks would endorse. It is something more like cosmic disappointment, the specific feeling of a universe that has a creator, but whose creator is not, in any meaningful sense, attending to the specific needs of the people living in it. The show's Death, the character of Death himself, who has appeared in multiple episodes and who has a specific personality and a specific set of problems that are comic in their recognizability, adds another dimension to this theology. Death in the show's universe is not fearsome in the way that Death is traditionally fearsome. He is tired. He has a job that never ends, that offers no days off, that involves confronting the full range of human ending in all its forms with no emotional support structure and very little professional acknowledgement. He is, in the show's rendering, a civil servant of the cosmic order, competent, put upon, mildly resentful of the specific demands of his role. What does it mean that this show has created a universe in which both God and Death are bureaucratic rather than transcendent figures? It means, I think, that the universe of the show is a universe in which the traditional sources of cosmic comfort, the idea that there is a plan, that suffering has meaning, that death leads somewhere worth going, are not available in their familiar forms. The plan, if there is one, is being managed by someone who is less than fully attentive. The meaning of suffering, if it exists, is not being communicated through any reliable channel. And death, when it comes, is delivered by a figure who would honestly rather be somewhere else. This is, underneath the comedy, a somewhat desolate theology. It is also, I would argue, a recognizably honest one. Honest to the specific experience of navigating a universe in which the evidence for cosmic order and care is not always easy to find, in which the systems that are supposed to provide meaning and protection are revealed, on close examination, to be staffed by people or beings who are doing their best, but who are not quite equal to the full scale of what they have been asked to manage. The Griffin family lives in this universe and they manage as people manage in the actual universe, not by finding comfort in cosmic order, because the cosmic order is not reliably comforting, but by finding comfort in each other. By finding the specific warmth of human and dog proximity, of shared meals and shared jokes, and the specific low-grade chaos of living in close quarters with other people who drive you crazy and whom you love anyway. Heaven, in the episodes that visit it, is depicted as a continuation of essentially earthly existence, clouds and leisure, and the continued presence of people you knew in life. It is not transcendence, it is not transformation. It is, at its most optimistic, a retirement that you access by dying. This is the show's answer to the question of what comes after. More of the same, but without the suffering. It is a modest answer. It is also, in its way, a kind and human one. The specific comfort of a universe that says, the things you love here will be there too. Hell is more interesting, and the show has depicted it with more creative attention. Hell in this universe is not fire and brimstone in the traditional sense. It is the continuation of your worst characteristics, your most destructive patterns, your most persistent failures, magnified without the possibility of change. Hell is being the worst version of yourself forever, without any of the external pressures that might, in life, occasionally force you to be better. It is the self without consequence. And in a show that has spent 25 years depicting what people do when they are shielded from consequence, when the reset button is always available, when the morning always comes fresh and untouched by the damage of the day before. Hell is, in fact, the logical endpoint of the show's own mythology extended to its darkest conclusion. Section 15. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery and the Mystery of Peter's Employment. Let us consider, for a moment, the mystery of how Peter Griffin keeps his job. Peter Griffin has, across the course of the show's run, done things at and around his place of employment that would, in any realistic workplace environment, result in immediate termination followed by significant legal consequences. He has caused property damage of extraordinary scale. He has been involved in incidents that endangered the safety of coworkers and the public. He has demonstrated levels of professional incompetence that would be remarkable in any field, and that in the specific field of brewery operations, a field that involves the management of large quantities of flammable and otherwise hazardous materials, would represent a genuinely serious liability risk. He has at various points been fired. The show has acknowledged this reality. There are episodes in which Peter loses his job and must find a new one, in which the Griffins face the specific domestic disruption of reduced income and uncertain employment. These episodes are among the most grounded in the show's catalog because they depict a form of consequence, economic consequence, that is recognizable to most of the show's audience and that carries genuine dramatic weight. But Peter always returns to the brewery. The employment instability is always resolved. The specific economic precarity of the episodes in which he has lost his job is always overcome, and the status quo, Peter at work, Peter employed, Peter's family financially sustained, is always restored. Why not in the narrative sense? The narrative always provides reasons, always invents circumstances that restore Peter to employment and financial stability. But in the deeper sense, why does this universe insist on Peter's employment? Why is the restoration of Peter's job one of the things the show's reset mechanism reliably produces? One answer, and it is a real one, is that Peter's employment at the brewery is a structural necessity of the comedy premise. A Man Without Work is a domestic comedy with different dynamics from the one the show has built, and the show needs Peter to be a working person rather than an unemployed one in order to maintain the specific comedic engine that drives it. This is true, but it is not entirely satisfying as an explanation. The deeper answer is that Peter's employment, Peter's status as a man who goes to work, who has a job, who participates in the economic and social structures of conventional adult life, is part of his identity in a way that the show has never fully examined, but that is always present. Peter is, at his most fundamental level, a working-class man. His sense of himself is built on this category. His relationships with his friends at the bar, his place in the neighborhood, his sense of his own worth and legitimacy as a husband and father, all of these are connected, in ways that the show depicts without always articulating, to his status as a person who has a job and does the job and brings home what the job provides. The mystery of Peter's employment is, in this frame, the mystery of identity and dignity. Peter needs his job not because the household needs his income. The show has demonstrated, across various episodes, that the Griffins are financially supported in ways that go beyond Peter's salary, including by the Pewterschmidt family's generosity in ways that Peter either doesn't know about or chooses not to fully acknowledge. He needs his job because the job is part of the specific story he tells about himself. And the universe of the show, because it is fundamentally a universe of psychological accommodation, provides the job whenever it is needed. Because without it, something in the foundational architecture of who Peter Griffin is would give way. This is one of the quieter mysteries in the show's lore, but it is a real one. The brewery is not just a workplace, it is a monument to the specific thing Peter needs to believe about himself. Section 16. The Drunken Clam and the Nature of Male Friendship on Spooner Street. The Drunken Clam is the bar where Peter Griffin and his friends drink. It is, in the show's mythology, one of the most consistent and stable locations, a place that has been present from the earliest seasons and that has served as the social center of the adult male friendships that constitute one of the show's primary ensemble relationships. Peter, Joe Swanson, Cleveland Brown, and Glenn Quagmire have, across 25 years of episodes, occupied the same bar stools in the same bar and conducted the specific kind of friendship that the show depicts as the primary social bond of men in this context. The friendship these men have is worth examining because it is one of the show's most persistent depictions of a specific kind of human relationship and one that carries its own set of unanswered questions. The friendship between Peter, Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire is real. The show has depicted it as real. There are episodes in which the bonds between these men are tested and survive the testing, in which genuine care is expressed in the specific, inarticulate way that the show attributes to men of their type and generation, in which the bar proves to be a space of genuine comfort and genuine solidarity, rather than simply a setting for comedy. The Drunken Clam is where these men go when things are wrong, and the fact that they go there together is not trivial. But the friendship also has its own mysteries. The most fundamental one is the question of why these specific men are friends with each other, what the actual basis of their connection is beyond proximity and the shared habit of the bar. Peter, Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire are not obviously similar people. They have different professional identities, different personality types, different value systems that occasionally produce genuine conflict. Their shared social context, the neighborhood, the bar, brought them together, but social context alone does not explain the specific depth of connection that the show, in its best episodes, depicts these friendships as having. One answer is that the friendship is based on mutual need rather than mutual similarity, that each of these men provides something the others require that they cannot easily get elsewhere. Peter provides perhaps the specific warmth of someone who is consistently, genuinely glad to see you, who finds your company satisfying in a way that does not involve calculation or assessment. Joe provides the specific dignity of someone who has not given up, who maintains his sense of worth and his engagement with the world despite circumstances that could have destroyed either. Cleveland provides the specific steadiness of someone who has seen more of the world than the bar and who carries that broader context lightly. Quagmire provides the specific entertainment of someone who is always, almost always, slightly more chaotic than the situation requires, who makes the ordinary feel less ordinary simply by being present in it. They need each other in ways the show has depicted in fragments but never assembled into a complete argument. And the bar, the specific geography of the Drunken Clam, with its particular arrangement of space and its particular accumulated history as the location of years of shared evenings, is the container for this need. The bar is not where these men go because there is nowhere else to go. It is where they go because the bar is where they are most fully themselves in each other's presence. It is where the specific performances of their daily lives, the competent cop, the brewery worker, the pilot, the domestic father, are temporarily suspended in favor of something more unguarded. The mystery of the Drunken Clam is the mystery of what these men talk about when the comedy is not watching. The show has, across thousands of scenes set in the bar, given us the comedy version of the conversation, the setup and punchline, the cutaway inspiring line, the joke that the camera reaches for in preference to anything else. But the real conversations, the ones that happen in the actual texture of years of friendship, are mostly not depicted. We see the moments. We don't see the continuity between moments that would give us the full picture of what these men are to each other. That continuity is one of the show's most significant unmade things. It is the story that happens between the stories, and the gaps between the filmed scenes, in the hours and years that the camera doesn't follow. It is the full version of the friendship, and we will never see it because the show's format does not accommodate that kind of sustained, undramatic intimacy. But it is there. You can feel it in the specific way these men sit together. The ease of bodies that have occupied the same space many hundreds of times. The specific shorthand of people who know each other well enough to communicate in implications rather than full sentences. The friendship is real. The years are real. The Drunken Clam is real, in the specific way that places that have held important things become real through the holding. Section 17. Chris Griffin and the Question of the Forgotten Child. In a show that has devoted substantial narrative attention to Peter's bumbling, Brian's existential difficulty, Stewie's impossible genius, Lois's constrained capability, and Meg's designated suffering, one of the Griffin children has managed, across the entire run of the show, to be remarkably, consistently underexamined. Chris Griffin, the middle child, the teenage son, the large, awkward boy who inherits his father's physique without inheriting either his father's social ease or his father's specific brand of comic foolishness. Chris is, in many ways, the show's greatest mystery precisely because the show has so rarely treated him as a mystery at all. Chris is, on the surface, simple. He is large. He is not particularly smart. He is interested in art, a trait the show introduces and occasionally returns to, but never fully develops into a sustained character element. He has a specific set of insecurities related to his physical appearance and his social competence. He has, at various points, crushes and friendships that are depicted with occasional warmth, but that do not accumulate into anything resembling a coherent developmental arc. He is, in the shorthand of ensemble comedy, the simple one. The character who exists primarily to react, whose function in the family dynamic is to be lovable without being complicated. But every character is more complicated than their function in the ensemble. And Chris Griffin, examined without the shorthand, is a person whose specific situation in the Griffin family is one of the most psychologically interesting in the show. Consider, Chris Griffin is the son who most resembles his father. He has Peter's build, Peter's general social register, Peter's specific combination of physical presence and social uncertainty. He is what Peter was before the years of accumulated decisions and accumulated disappointments made Peter what he currently is. He is the before image of the man at the center of the family. And what the show has consistently not examined is what it means for a boy to grow up as the physical and social echo of a father whose relationship to his own limitations is, at best, unresolved. The psychology of resemblance in families, of being the child who looks most like, who acts most like, who carries most obviously the particular qualities of a parent, is one of the richest areas of family psychology, and the show has the material to explore it with Chris, and has consistently declined to do so. Chris has a bedroom in which, across the show's early and middle seasons, an evil monkey lives. This is one of the show's more peculiar recurring elements. A monkey who exists in Chris's closet, who frightens Chris by pointing at him in a specific way, who is for many seasons treated as a comedic running joke, and then, in a late episode, given a backstory and a resolution that the show handles with the combination of emotional weight and comedy deflation. That is its signature move when confronting its own recurring darkness. The evil monkey is resolved. The monkey turns out to have had a comprehensible reason for his behavior. The relationship between Chris and the monkey is addressed and, in some sense, healed. And then the monkey is gone, and Chris's bedroom is no longer the place where the inexplicable fear lives, and the show moves on. But the monkey's presence across those years, the years during which Chris grew from early adolescence into later adolescence, during which the fundamental questions of identity and competence and social belonging that define adolescent experience were being navigated, raises a question. The show never asked directly, what was it like for Chris to grow up with an inexplicable presence in his room? Not in the comedy sense. The show addressed the comedy sense repeatedly, but in the actual psychological sense. What does it do to a young person's development to have, in the most private space of their life, a source of consistent, unresolved fear? The evil monkey is, in this reading, a symbol of something that the show introduced with more psychological insight than it necessarily intended. The unexplained terror in the adolescent bedroom. The thing in the closet that everyone outside the bedroom either cannot see or chooses not to take seriously. The specific loneliness of being frightened by something that the adults in your life treat as comic or imaginary. Chris Griffin carried the monkey for years. He was never fully believed about the monkey. He navigated his entire early adolescence with that particular fear as a constant feature of his private life. And the show treated this as funny. The mystery of Chris Griffin is the mystery of the character who never gets to be the complicated one, who exists adjacent to the show's most emotionally intensive character work, and whose own complexity never quite gets to fully surface. Somewhere in the Chris Griffin lore is a person worth knowing in the way that the show has allowed us to know Meg or Brian or Stewie. That person is present in the material. He just never got his episode. Section 18. The finances of Spooner Street. Who is really paying? There is a practical mystery running beneath all the psychological and philosophical mysteries we have been exploring tonight, and it is a simpler and more grounded mystery than those. How does the Griffin family afford their life? Peter works at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. His income, at the level of seniority that his tenure would imply, is a working-class income. Comfortable for a working person, but not the kind of income that would support, without strain, a house in Newport County. A family of 5, including 3 growing children, regular nights at a bar, and the serial property damage and legal exposure that Peter's behavior generates on a near-weekly basis. Lois does not work for income in the standard sense. She plays piano, and there are episodes that reference her teaching piano to neighborhood children. But this is not depicted as a significant income stream. She manages the household, which is labor of significant value, but it is not paid labor in the economic sense. The financial math, when you do it, does not add up. The Griffin family's apparent standard of living is meaningfully higher than Peter's income, as depicted, should be able to sustain. And the show has, across various episodes, offered explanations for this gap that are worth examining. The most significant explanation is the Pewterschmidt factor. The show has revealed, in ways that are sometimes explicit and sometimes strongly implied, that Carter Pewterschmidt has financial involvement in the Griffin household that goes beyond the occasional gift or loan. There is an episode, the specific episode is part of the accumulated Pewterschmidt lore, in which it is revealed that Carter has, for years, been paying the mortgage on the Griffin house. Not as a loan that Peter and Lois are repaying, as a payment, a direct financial subsidy of his daughter's domestic life that Peter either does not know about or that he has accommodated within his own self-concept in a way that does not disturb his sense of being the family's provider. This revelation, if you sit with it, is extraordinary in its implications. It means that the entire premise of the Griffin family's financial independence, the premise that Peter's working-class job sustains the family's comfortable life, that Peter is the provider in the functional sense, is at least partly false. The family is, to a significant degree, being sustained by the Pewterschmidt wealth that Lois ostensibly turned her back on when she married Peter. What does Carter get from this arrangement? This is where the psychology gets interesting. Carter Pewterschmidt is a man whose relationship to love and control is one of the show's recurring themes. He does not express care through warmth or presence or attention. He expresses care through resources, through the deployment of financial power in ways that maintain his influence over the people he loves, while appearing, superficially, to be acts of generosity. By paying the Griffin mortgage, Carter maintains a fundamental financial relationship with his daughter's family. He is, in the most literal sense, the owner of the ground on which their domestic life is built. Does Lois know? This is a question the show has handled ambiguously, which is to say, it has handled it with the show's characteristic preference for not resolving the ambiguities that make its characters most interesting. If Lois knows, if she has always known that her father's money is underneath the apparent independence of her chosen life, then her situation is considerably more complicated than it appears. She did not, in the simplest sense, escape the Pewterschmidt financial world. She relocated to a different territory within it, one in which the financial connection is less visible, less directly controlling, but no less present. If she does not know, if the mortgage payments are an arrangement that Carter has made without Lois's full awareness, then Carter Pewterschmidt has maintained a financial claim on his daughter's life without her consent, which is a form of control that the show depicts in other contexts as characteristic of him. Either way, the finances of Spooner Street are not what they appear to be. The working-class family in the modest house is, at some level, a performance being underwritten by the exact kind of inherited wealth that Lois's marriage to Peter was supposed to be a departure from. The independence was never fully real. The Pewterschmidt world was never fully left behind. This is one of the show's quieter and more honest insights about the nature of class mobility and class departure. You can choose a working-class life. You can mean the choice fully and make it with genuine conviction. But if the safety net of inherited wealth is present, even if you do not fully acknowledge its presence, even if you have structured your life to minimize the visibility of that safety net, then the choice is different from the choice that someone without the safety net makes. The risk is different. The stakes are different, the freedom is real, but it is a freedom operating within a frame. Lois Griffin chose Peter. She chose Spooner Street. She chose the modest house and the working-class life. And the choice was genuine. But the frame was still there. Section 19. What Adam West tells us about the show's heart. There is a reason that the episode in which Mayor Adam West died felt different from most things the show has done. Adam West, the real Adam West, the actor who played Batman in the 1966 television series and who voiced the character of Mayor Adam West in this show for 16 seasons, passed away in June of 2017. The show chose to address his death directly in an episode that served as a tribute to the actor and as an in-universe acknowledgement of the death of the character. The episode is called Adam West High, and it is, by common agreement among the show's audience, one of the most genuinely moving things the show has produced. Why, what is it about this particular memorial that achieved the emotional resonance that many of the show's more deliberate attempts at emotional seriousness have failed to achieve? Part of the answer is the specific quality of Adam West's contribution to the show. Mayor Adam West, the character, not the person, was one of the few recurring characters in the show's ensemble who was allowed to be entirely, unapologetically himself at all times. He operated by an internal logic that was entirely coherent within itself and entirely impenetrable from the outside. He was not relatable. He was not sympathetic in the conventional sense. He was simply, fully, completely present in every moment he inhabited, a person whose relationship to reality was so specific and so consistent that you never doubted, even when you had no idea what he was going to say next, that what he said would be exactly true to who he was. This quality, the quality of complete self-coherence, of being recognizably yourself in every moment without apology or performance, is one of the rarest things the show has ever depicted. Most of the show's characters are, as we have spent the last 18 sections exploring, people who are performing versions of themselves, who are managing the gap between who they are and who they present themselves as being, who are working constantly and with varying degrees of success to protect themselves from the specific vulnerabilities of being fully known. Mayor Adam West had none of this. He was exactly what he appeared to be, and what he appeared to be was not a coherent adult human, but something more like an embodied principle. The principle of commitment, of full investment in whatever the moment required, regardless of what the surrounding reality might think of that investment. The tribute episode works because it is not just honoring Adam West the actor, though it is doing that. It is honoring a specific quality that the character embodied, a quality that the show has not often given itself permission to honor. Because the show's usual register does not accommodate the kind of simple, uncomplicated dignity that Mayor Adam West possessed. The show is complicated. It is ironic. It is layered with self-awareness and self-deprecation. Mayor Adam West was none of these things. He was simply himself, and he was himself completely. The emotion of the tribute comes from the recognition that this quality, the quality of being completely yourself without irony or performance or protective distance, is valuable beyond measure. That a universe in which it exists is a better universe for its existence. That when it is gone, what is gone is genuinely irreplaceable. And the show's ability to honor this quality, to recognize it and grieve its loss, tells us something important about the show's own heart. Beneath the irony, beneath the self-awareness, beneath the cutaway gags and the shock humor and the decades of accumulated cynicism, there is a show that knows what it values, that knows what it has been given, that is capable, when the moment is real enough, of setting down its armor and simply grieving. Mayor Adam West's memorial episode is proof that the show has a heart, a real one. It does not always have access to it. It does not always remember it is there. But it is there, and occasionally the show finds its way back to it, and when it does, the result is something worth staying awake for. Section 20. The show's relationship to its own darkness. A reckoning. We have been walking down this impossible street for a long time tonight, and we have looked at many things. We have looked at characters whose surface presentation conceals depths of suffering and complexity. We have looked at a geography that does not quite cohere. We have looked at a mythology of death and return that expresses something real about the show's relationship to loss. We have looked at the theories people have built around the show's inconsistencies, and we have found in those theories not just fan speculation, but genuine critical insight. We have looked at the show's comedy machinery and asked what it is protecting against, and we have found that the answer, when it comes, is always some form of the same thing. It is protecting against the specific pain of being a person who loves people who are going to disappoint you, who are going to leave you, who are not always going to be able to love you back in the form you need. The show's darkness is real. We have been in and around it all night. The Meg storylines carry genuine darkness. The Brian character, at his worst, carries genuine darkness. The Peter arc, across the seasons, carries genuine darkness. The darkness of watching someone become, incrementally, less of who they were. The Herbert character carries a darkness that the show has never been willing to fully confront. The geographic impossibility of the town carries a metaphysical darkness. The suspicion that the entire universe being depicted is a construction rather than a reality. That there is something wrong at the foundation. But the darkness is not the whole of the show, and it is not what the show is fundamentally about. The show is, at its most fundamental level, about the specific difficulty and the specific value of belonging somewhere. Of having people who know you, who have seen you at your worst, and who have chosen, across many years and many disappointments, to keep choosing you. The Griffin family is dysfunctional in ways that the show has explored comprehensively and that we have examined in detail tonight. But the family exists. They keep choosing each other. They keep coming home to the White House with the blue door, and the house is still there when they come home. This is not a small thing. In a cultural moment that has plenty of representations of fractured families, of the atomization of domestic life, of the specific loneliness of the modern condition. In this moment, a show about a family that keeps coming home to each other, that keeps surviving its own dysfunction by the specific grace of continuing to care, is saying something worth saying. The show does not always say it well. It has, at various points, treated its own most vulnerable characters with a carelessness that reflects poorly on the people making it. It has used shock and transgression as substitutes for insight. It has confused being loud with being alive. But it has also, in its best episodes and its best moments, demonstrated something genuine. Something about the texture of domestic life, about the specific way that love persists in the absence of the conditions that are supposed to be necessary for its survival, about the human capacity for loyalty to people who do not deserve it and cannot quite explain why they receive it. The Griffins do not deserve each other in the simple sense. They have all, at various points, failed each other badly. They have been cruel and negligent and selfish and oblivious. But they are still together. Spooner Street is still their street. The blue door is still their door. There is a kind of love that is not about deserving. That is not conditional on good behavior or consistent warmth or the daily performance of care. It is the love that predates all of that. The love that exists in the foundation of a family before anyone can articulate it, that runs beneath the dysfunction like an underground river, that the dysfunction sits on top of without quite being able to extinguish. The Griffin family has this love. The show depicts it imperfectly and inconsistently, but it depicts it. And in its best moments, it depicts it with a warmth and a specificity that feel true. This is the mystery that all the other mysteries in this show are circling. Not the time travel, not the geography, not the death and resurrection, not the psychological depths of the individual characters, as real and as interesting as those depths are. The mystery is why this family, with all of its dysfunction, with all of its damage, with all of the specific cruelties and indifferences that have accumulated across 25 years of episodes, why this family is still, after all of it, a family. Why the house is still their house. Why the love is still there. And the show's answer, when it finds its way to the answer, is the only honest answer that a question like this can have. The love is still there because they have not stopped choosing it. Because every day, in the specific and imperfect way that imperfect people choose things, the Griffins have chosen the blue door, have chosen the impossible town, have chosen each other. Not perfectly, not consistently, not without causing harm, but again, and again, and again. Section 21, Stewie and the Future That Never Arrives. There is an episode, referenced in fan discussions as one of the more thoughtful pieces of speculative storytelling the show has attempted, in which an adult version of Stewie Griffin appears. Future Stewie is a person who has grown into someone that the show treats as a kind of dark joke, a portrait of what the early Stewie's trajectory might have produced in adulthood. The episode does not commit fully to this future as the canonical outcome of Stewie's development. The show cannot commit to futures because commitment to futures would threaten the perpetual present that the show requires. But the glimpse is there. What the show cannot do is commit to a future for Stewie that is satisfying, that resolves the tensions in his character in a way that honors both what he was and what he might become. The evil genius baby who has been transformed across the seasons into someone softer and more vulnerable and more emotionally present. This character has an arc that the show has been tracing for over 15 seasons without quite bringing to a destination. Stewie is on a journey that the show has depicted in fragments. He is becoming something. He has not arrived at what he is becoming. The British accent is still present. The time machine still exists, though it is used less frequently and less purposefully than it once was. The weapons still appear, but they appear now as nostalgic callbacks rather than as expressions of an ongoing character commitment. The evil genius is still in there. You can see him sometimes, when Stewie has a flash of the old ferocity. the old specific brightness that characterized his earliest seasons. But the evil genius is no longer the organizing principle of the character. He has been displaced by something more complicated and less certain. Where is Stewie Griffin going? What is the destination of the journey that the show has been charting in its inconsistent and fragmentary way across all these years? This is one of the show's most genuinely open questions, one that the show's continued existence will someday have to answer, even if the answer it gives is the non-answer of the perpetual present, even if the journey simply continues without arriving anywhere. The best version of a destination for Stewie Griffin would honor both the evil genius and the vulnerable child. It would acknowledge that these are not opposites, that the person who built weapons in his crib and the person who wept over Brian in the vault are the same person, and that the integrity of the character requires holding both of these truths simultaneously rather than choosing between them. The show has come closer to this in some episodes than in others. Send in Stewie, Please is the closest it has come. The episode that most honestly depicted the relationship between Stewie's persona and his actual self, that most clearly showed what is underneath the construction. And what is underneath the construction is not weakness, and it is not villainy. What is underneath is a child who wants to be seen and who has not yet figured out that being seen does not have to be as dangerous as it has always felt. This is Stewie's journey, the journey from the armor to the person inside it. From the plasma cannon to the voice that drops the accent and says what it actually means. The show may never get him there. But the journey is happening, slowly, inconsistently, across 25 years of episodes that keep returning, despite the comedy and the chaos, to this small person in the yellow shirt who is learning, in his own impossible way, how to be known. Section 22. The mysteries we will never solve, and why that's okay. We have been walking this street for a long time tonight. The hour is late, and the houses along Spooner Street are very quiet. And the questions we have been carrying, the questions about who these people are and why they keep choosing each other, and what the strange geography of this impossible place means and where all of this is going. These questions are not going to be answered tonight. Some of them are not going to be answered ever. And this is, when you reach the end of a long night with a complex story, the thing you have to decide how to feel about. There are people who experience unresolved questions as a form of failure, as something the story owes them that it is withholding. If you feel that way about the mysteries of this show, that feeling is legitimate. Stories make implicit promises to the people who engage with them, and some of those promises involve closure, resolution, the satisfaction of the answered question. When long-running stories leave major questions unresolved, when the mythology they have spent years building turns out not to have a complete internal architecture, when the threads that were pulled turn out not to lead anywhere definitive, the disappointment is real and is not unreasonable. But there is another way to be with unresolved questions, and it is the way that the best long-form storytelling teaches, over time, to its most attentive audiences. The unresolved question is not always a promise broken. Sometimes it is an opening held open. Sometimes the mystery is not the thing that the story failed to explain, but the thing it succeeded in preserving, the thing it kept alive and present and generative across all the years of its existence by never collapsing it into a definitive answer. The mystery of who Peter Griffin actually is, beneath the performance of foolishness, beneath the accumulated injury and the childhood of conditional love. This question does not have an answer that the show could give us without destroying the thing that makes it interesting. If the show told us definitively that Peter is actually intelligent and has been performing limitation, or definitively that his limitations are all the product of injury and alcohol, or definitively that he is simply as limited as he appears, and there is no mystery to solve, any of these answers would resolve the tension that makes the question worth asking. The question is alive because it is unanswered. The mystery of Peter Griffin is more true to the experience of knowing a person like Peter Griffin than any definitive explanation could be, because the people we know in our own lives are not fully explained to us either. They contain mysteries that we carry, as the people who love them, across years and decades of shared life. The mystery of the town's geography is more honest than a coherent map would be, because the places that matter to us are never simply geographic. They are emotional landscapes that shift with our relationship to them, that look different depending on what we are carrying when we enter them. The town is inconsistent because the Griffin's relationship to it is inconsistent. Some days the town is one thing, and other days it is another, and the inconsistency is not a flaw in the storytelling. It is the storytelling. The mysteries of this impossible street, held together by the specific gravity of a family's choice to keep choosing each other, these mysteries are not problems to be solved. They are the texture of a particular kind of love. The love that persists in the absence of explanation. The love that keeps happening even when you cannot fully account for why. This is what 25 years of Spooner Street has been about. Not the plot, not the specific sequence of episodes and storylines and character developments and retcons and revivals. Beneath all of that, the show has been telling one story. Here is a family. Here is the specific impossibility of their love for each other. Here is how they choose it, imperfectly, every day. The house at 31 Spooner Street is quiet tonight. The lights are off in all the windows. Peter is asleep in the bedroom. Lois is beside him, her hand somewhere close to his even in sleep, in the specific way of two people who have shared a bed for decades. Meg is in her room, surviving, which is what Meg does and what she will always do, because Meg Griffin is tougher than the show has ever fully acknowledged. Chris is down the hall, in a room that no longer contains a monkey, in a piece that was a long time coming. Stewie is in his crib, which has never looked like a crib, which has always looked like a small research facility, which is exactly what it is. And he is awake, as he often is at this hour, looking at the ceiling with the specific watchfulness of a person who is thinking about something that he cannot yet put into words. Brian is downstairs. He is in the place he always is when the house is quiet, on the couch, with a drink he may or may not finish, in the specific stillness of a person who is, tonight, not running from anything. Tonight, Brian Griffin is simply present. In the house, on the street, in the specific, impossible place where his life has happened, where the people he loves are asleep above him in their imperfect rooms. The street is dark. The town is quiet. Whatever strange geography holds this place together is holding it for now. The questions that have no answers will still be there in the morning, and the morning will come regardless. And the family will wake and eat and argue and love and make each other laugh, and make each other cry and do all the things that families do on this street, in this town, in this universe that makes no geographic sense and follows no physical laws and has been running, somehow, for over 25 years. The mystery is why it keeps going. The answer is that it keeps going because it is, in some fundamental and unaccountable way, worth going. And that is enough. For tonight, that is more than enough. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let the questions rest. They will be there in the morning, patient and unanswered, waiting to be asked again. The mysteries of Spooner Street are the kind of mysteries that wait. Let your body go heavy. Let the images of the street fade gently. The White House with the blue door. The amber pools of streetlights on the pavement. The low hum of the impossible highway. The distant sound of a television playing somewhere inside a house where the lights have all gone out. Peter is asleep. Lois is asleep. Meg is surviving. Chris is at peace. Stewie is thinking. Brian is, for one quiet night, not running. The street is real. The family is real. The love is real, in the particular way that things we choose every day, despite every reason not to, become real. Sleep well. We will walk this street again. If this journey through the mysteries and lore of this extraordinary fictional universe helped you relax and drift off, it would mean the world to leave a comment below. Tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? What mystery do you want to explore next? Every comment builds this community that we have been so grateful to create together. And if you have not already subscribed, now is the moment. It's free. And it guarantees you will not miss the next long, slow, deep exploration of the things that keep us up at night, made to help us finally rest. I will see you in the next one. Section 23, the storytelling device that became a character. The cutaway gag as mythology. There is one more element of the show's universe that deserves its own space in any serious examination of the show's lore, and it is not a character in the traditional sense. It is the show's most distinctive formal feature, the cutaway gag. And it is worth talking about not just as a technique, but as a mythological element in its own right. Because if the cutaway gag is understood as a structural feature of the universe, rather than simply as a storytelling device, it tells us something about the nature of time and consciousness in the world. The Griffins inhabit that nothing else in the show quite approaches. A cutaway gag operates like this. A character makes a comparative statement. This is worse than the time I... And the universe of the show responds by showing that time. The world of Spooner Street opens up, briefly, to accommodate a memory, or an association, or an alternative scenario, and then it closes again and the characters continue as though the opening never happened. The cutaway is a parenthesis in time, a brief excursion into a past or hypothetical that is visually present but narratively discontinuous. In the early seasons, the cutaways were tight and purposeful. They were genuine elaborations of specific jokes, visual punchlines to verbal setups, things that the characters were genuinely remembering or referencing. They were, us, in this period, illustrations of the characters' inner lives. When Peter says this is worse than a particular memory, and the show shows us the memory, we are briefly inside Peter's head. We are seeing the specific texture of his experience, the particular events that constitute his personal history, the things he carries. What happens when the cutaway gag is used not as illustration, but as substitution, when it replaces the story rather than elaborating it, is what the show's critics have identified as a form of creative bankruptcy. But I want to offer a different frame for the same phenomenon, one that is less about craft judgment and more about mythological analysis. What if the cutaway, in its more excessive later uses, is telling us something true about the specific way that time operates in the Griffin universe? In this universe, time is not linear in the way it is in our own experience. Events from the past are not fixed behind the characters, but are somehow co-present with the present, available to be accessed and re-experienced with no temporal distance. The characters do not simply remember things, they inhabit memories, briefly, parenthetically, but with full sensory presence. The past is, in the Griffin universe, always adjacent to the present, always available, always potentially as real as whatever is currently happening. This is, in the show's own mythological terms, a form of temporal permeability that would explain several of the show's other distinctive features. The character's immunity to aging is consistent with a universe in which time is not linear. The show's tolerance for retcon and reset is consistent with a universe in which the past is not fixed but remains accessible and revisable. The ability of characters to die and then return is consistent with a universe in which the distinction between present and past is not absolute, in which a dead character is not gone but simply inhabiting an earlier position on a timeline that remains fully present. The cutaway gag in this frame is not a storytelling shortcut. It is a formal expression of the specific physics of the Griffin universe, a universe in which any moment in time can be accessed from any other moment, in which the past is as present as the present, and in which the characters carry all of their personal history, not as memory, but as a kind of temporal simultaneous presence. Peter does not remember the incident with the bad coupon. He is, briefly, there again. And then he is back. This is an unusual kind of consciousness to inhabit. It would explain, among other things, why the characters never seem to accumulate wisdom in the conventional sense. They do not learn from the past because the past is never quite behind them. It is always available to be re-entered, and re-entering it restores the conditions that produced whatever lesson they were supposed to take from it. They cannot move forward in the conventional way because the timeline they inhabit is not moving forward in the conventional way. There is a philosophical tradition, it appears in various forms in Eastern and Western thought, that describes a certain kind of consciousness as existing in a perpetual present that encompasses past and future simultaneously. The enlightened mind in some of these traditions is one that does not experience time as linear, but as something more like a landscape that can be traversed in any direction, where all points remain accessible at all times. The Griffin universe operates something like this. Not enlightened exactly, because enlightenment implies clarity and peace that the Griffins do not consistently possess, but temporally open in a way that most fictional universes are not. The cutaway gag is the formal expression of this openness. Every time a character reaches back and the universe shows us what they are reaching back to, The show is demonstrating the specific quality of time in this world. It is showing us that Spooner Street exists in a temporal register that is different from the one you and I inhabit, one that is strange and sometimes chaotic and often funny and occasionally deeply sad, but that is, in its particular way, extraordinarily rich. Every moment here contains all the other moments. Every scene is attended by the entire personal history of the people in it. The weight of the cutaway universe, all those accumulated memories, all those parenthetical excursions into times that happened and times that were imagined, is the weight of lives fully and complexly lived. Even the lives of animated characters in an impossible Rhode Island. Even the life of a large man who means well. Section 24. One last walk down the street before morning. The things we carry out of long, deep engagements with stories. The things that stay with us after the lights come back on, after the screen goes dark, after the walk home and the long process of returning from wherever the story took us. These are not usually the plot points. They are not the specific events or the specific revelations. They are the feelings, the impressions, the particular quality of the world the story built, and the specific way it felt to be inside it. The feeling of this universe, the specific emotional texture of Spooner Street and the Griffin family and the strange, impossible town with its inconsistent geography, is one of the more distinctive feelings in American popular culture. It is warm and dark simultaneously. It is funny in a way that sometimes trips over something that is genuinely not funny. It is populated by characters who are, at their worst, people you would cross the street to avoid, and who are, at their best, people you would cross the street to know. It is a universe that does not quite believe in consequence and does not quite believe in endings and does not quite believe in the permanent reality of loss. And this disbelief is both its most comforting feature and its deepest limitation. The mysteries we have explored tonight, Peter's hidden depth, Brian's constructed persona, Stewie's armored vulnerability, Lois's contained capability, Meg's extraordinary resilience, Quagmire's weight, the town's impossible geography, the show's relationship to death and return, the fan theories that illuminate the show's darkness, the crossovers that reveal its place in a larger universe, the theology of its cosmos, the financing of its domestic life, the memorial of its most coherent character, the cutaway gag as temporal mythology. All of these mysteries circle the same center. They are all, in the end, asking the same question. Not about the show exactly, but through the show, about something the show has been a vehicle for exploring across 25 years of episodes. The question is, what holds people together? Not ideally. Not in the best possible circumstances. Not in the stories we tell about love when we are trying to make love sound like something grand and clear and deserved. But actually, in the messy, inconsistent, imperfect reality of people who are not at their best, who have chosen each other without quite knowing what they were choosing, who have stayed together through things that would justify leaving. What holds them together? The show's answer, given across all these years and all these episodes and all these mysteries that refuse to resolve cleanly, is not a simple one. The show does not have a simple answer. It does not believe in simple answers, and this is, perhaps, the most honest thing about it. It believes in the specific answer that the specific family gives, the answer that is not a principle but a practice, not a statement, but a repeated daily choice. They choose the blue door. Every day, in their imperfect and sometimes barely functional way, they choose the blue door. They come back to the house. They sit at the same table. They wake up in the same rooms. And the love that has accumulated in this space, impure, inconsistent, damaged by years of dysfunction and comedy and genuine cruelty and genuine warmth, is still there, still present, still holding. This is what the show has been about. This is the mystery at the center of all the other mysteries. Not something to be solved, but something to be recognized, to be seen clearly, without flinching, in all its difficulty and all its beauty. The house is quiet now. The street is still. The question is always the same, and the answer is always the same, and neither of them will ever be any different. They chose, and they chose again. And they will choose tomorrow. On an impossible street, in a town that shouldn't exist, in a state whose geography doesn't quite accommodate them, the Griffins persist. And the persisting is the whole point. Sleep well.